Welcome back everyone, it's Eric from Rare Candy, and today Zach and I will finally be giving our set review of the new Sword and Shield set, kicking off the first set in the new Sword and Shield block of cards. And as with any new era of the Pokemon TCG, Sword and Shield brings us a couple of big changes. The most obvious new addition to the game is the inclusion of the new Pokemon V and Pokemon VMAX. So much like with the Pokemon GX of the previous Sun and Moon era, they give up anywhere between 2 and 3 prize cards, but lack the single-use GX move of their predecessors, and also have the ability to evolve into the massive new Pokemon VMAX cards. The other new change that we do need to keep in mind when discussing the cards in Sword and Shield is a change to the first turn rules, preventing the player who goes first from playing a supporter card on their first turn. Though this rule change currently is unconfirmed outside of Japan at the time of filming, if the history of the game is anything to go by, this will probably be a rule change that takes effect immediately when this set releases internationally, but we do need to at least point that out. The other thing to keep in mind for this set review is that at the time of recording, the official international set list has actually not yet been revealed. Though we are confident every card in this set review will appear in Sword and Shield, there is definitely a chance an extra unannounced trainer card or two could make their way into the final set as well. But the vast majority of cards for the international Sword and Shield set will be made up from Japan's Sword and Shield sets, as well as their starter set V decks. And before we kick off this review, let's just take a quick look at the rating system that we use. We have 3 different ratings that we can potentially give out to cards, and the first one is of course our bad rating. These cards have anywhere from no to very limited competitive potential outside of extremely select uses. So by and large, these are just going to be your bulk cards that you pull out of packs that you always sell off or just keep in a shoebox somewhere. For our second, more neutral rating, these cards have some competitive potential, but their viability might be stifled by other factors in the current metagame. An example I like to use a lot is, think of a card that is actually very strong, but maybe its worst matchup happens to be the most popular deck in a format at that time. And for our final good rating, these cards have high competitive potential, existing on a spectrum ranging from seeing mild play to seeing widespread play. So an easy way to think about this, if you guys are more familiar with a 1 to 5 rating scale, these are cards that would probably exist somewhere on that 3 to 5 spectrum. But of course, at the time of recording, we usually haven't had a chance to actually test with all of the new cards yet. So that's why we really don't like standing behind a firm numerical score and like a more general rating system here. But with all of that out of the way, we have a lot of cards to go over. And to make things easier on everyone, we've pinned timestamps to the top of the comment section so you guys can jump to any card that you want to hear about. And with Sword and Shield having over 200 cards, there is a lot to talk about. So get comfortable and let's see what Sword and Shield has in store for us. Alright guys, so the very first Pokemon V we're going to be talking about in the set review is going to be Celebi V. Celebi V is going to be a basic Pokemon. Much like with all the other Pokemon V, it gives up 2 prizes, much like the current GXs and the previous EXs. And it's a grass Pokemon, has 2 different attacks. The first of which, for a grass energy, you search your deck for up to 2 Pokemon and put them into your hand, and then shuffle your deck. And then its second attack for a grass and colorless is 50 plus 20 more damage for each of your bench Pokemon. So I have to say, for our first Pokemon V, I feel like this card's a little bit underwhelming at first glance. I think it has a couple of okay things going for it. Like the being able to search for 2 Pokemon's fine. I kind of wish it was, search for 2 Pokemon, put them on your bench, especially if you're giving up 2 prizes. I feel like I would like that a bit more. So first attack, it's like meh. And even the second attack is just kind of meh. If we just run through the math on this thing, if you have a full bench, you're doing 150 damage, which is fine. You're going to one-shot a lot of grass weak stuff if there is anything popular that emerges that's going to be grass weak. But I just think overall the card's like kind of just generally okay to bad. Like there's the new Rillaboom, which we can use to get this thing powered up. So the new Rillaboom, it's kind of like the old Vikavolt. We'll talk about it shortly as well. But it helps you get grass energy into play. So you could play it with that, but I don't know. I think there's a lot better grass attackers that we might want if we are playing like a Rillaboom deck or, something kind of like that. So I feel like I'm pretty unenthusiastic about this card overall. Zach, is there anything you think I might be missing? But I feel like this card just seems pretty weak.
No, I think you're pretty much on the money. I know that we've discussed it a little bit where it's just like, how can we make Lion Force a better attack if grass weakness does become more apparent in any given metagame? And I think that's where Celebi V has its only chance to shine. Other than that, there could be something that's it gets released in the future that makes Celebi better. Like the attack's not awful, but 150 for 2 is not the best attack. So maybe if you were to play with like a counter gain or even an expanded a counter energy, you can get the attack off a little bit more efficiently. Like you said, there's also other things like Rillaboom, but at the end of the day, I think I'd rather be powering up something a little bit more efficient or a little bit stronger for the attack. So I'd say Celebi V is semi-playable, but it's only going to be depending on its surroundings. So if fire is big, the same way that abilities are at the time of this recording is pretty huge, or fire types in general, this card's not going to see any play. However, if there's anything that changes that, such as water types or fighting types being a little bit more being more played in the metagame, maybe Celebi V has a chance. But it's just a little bit too weak for me at first glance. Not the most exciting V card, so hopefully there's some better cards furthermore in this set.
Next up, guys, we have another Pokemon V that is going to be Dhelmise V. Dhelmise V is a basic with 220 HP, so definitely the biggest of the two prize Pokemon we've looked at thus far, but has two different attacks here, the first of which for a grass energy does 30, and then if any of your grass Pokemon were knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack during their last turn, this attack does 90 more damage. And then its other attack for 2 grass and a colorless is 200, and this Pokemon can't use Giga Hammer during your next turn. So couple things. I mean, like I said, the HP is definitely a little bit impressive. We can see kind of where the HP is going for a lot of the two prize Pokemon now, which is pretty nice. So this thing's definitely, somewhat tanky, I suppose. The first attack is, I think at a glance, okay. We've seen a lot of these over the years, like even going as far back as, I think Terrakion's like one of the older ones I can think of from like 2011. So we've seen this style of attack for a while now, but I'm not sure how I feel about this. It's only 120. Like, if this was a couple of years ago, 120 would be fine because you could hit stuff for weakness and take one-hit knockouts, but I'm not a big fan of the number for this first attack. And then even for the second attack, this could be another Pokemon we potentially look at for like a Rillaboom deck. You could power Giga Hammer up with Rillaboom and do 200, but just 200 it's just, I mean, it sounds like a lot of damage, but it's when tag teams have 240 to like 280 HP, and Pokemon V have over 220 HP and VMAXs have over 300. 200 really isn't much different than like 160 as an example. So it sounds like a lot of damage, but the math is just kind of awkward. So yet again, Zach, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but starting with this card's like, it's not like god awful or anything, but it's just not enough.
No, and I completely agree with you. It's one of those cards where it's like, I think in Pokemon, I when it comes to being a player who attends a lot of events, I probably collect way too many cards that I think might be playable. And this is actually one of those cards that I might actually pick up a couple copies of. But the only reason why is the same reason why I picked up Kangaskhan GX promo, where it's like, I am paranoid of the future of like, they're going to be like, for each different V Pokemon that you have on your bench or something, like in the future, there would be an attack like that, or some kind of trainer like that, or maybe if there's a Dhelmise VMAX that comes out in the future. Those are the things that I'm a little bit worried of. At face value, if we're looking at this card directly, 220 HP it's okay. Nowadays, it seems crazy that we're talking about 220 HP just being okay, but we're dealing with a format where all the Pokemon are they have a thick amount of HP. 120 is just not really cutting it for a revenge-like attack. And 200, I'm sure that there's got to be something more powerful. Now, maybe if we were to rotate towards, or if we eventually just go Sword and Shield on, an attack like this will be a lot more, it will be a little bit more exciting. But it's one of those things where I think this is just going to be a casualty of it being the Sword and Shield base set of this new block that we're entering, where it's like, we're looking at the Dhelmise V, Pokemon's like, we're going to make a set that's pretty basic to allow players to introduce themselves to this new format, and then we're going to gradually add more with each set release. And that's how it's been for every single block that we've had in the past. So I think they're going to expand on the Sword and Shield cards. Dhelmise V looks like it's a casualty of that. Might see some fringe play as a tech card in a grass deck, or it might be the only basic that a Dhelmise VMAX can evolve into.
I think one practical application that exists currently, but it remains to be seen if this will even exist once Sword and Shield's injected into the mixes. This is actually a very efficient way at dealing with Keldeo GX. So if you're a deck that already plays something like Rainbow Energies, or maybe the new Aurora Energy coming out in this set, or a unit energy, whatever it might be, that can get Wrath of Wraths power up quickly, and you're susceptible to getting shut out by Keldeo GX, Dhelmise V actually can be a decent tech for that reason. But with Pokemon V entering the mix, really don't know if Keldeo is going to drop off. I know a lot of people have been hyping the new Zacian V as a new partner for ADP, so we might even see Keldeo kind of fall by the wayside. But I think right now, I think that's really the only practical application I can personally see. Maybe if water Pokemon in Sword and Shield didn't have their types changed from weak to grass to weak to lightning, maybe there would be another consideration for this card. But right now, there's just not a whole lot you're really hitting for weakness. But I think Keldeo GX is probably the main one that comes to mind if you really are dead set on trying to make this card work. So, like, this is a card I'm probably still going to say is I'm going to vote down ultimately, but not because it's bad. It's just outclassed by other things. Like, neither of these attacks is terrible by any stretch of imagination. They're just not good enough to actually break out and see competitive play. All right, next up, guys, we have the first of the new Galarian starter Pokemon that are coming out in this new Sword and Shield set. That's going to be Rillaboom. So Rillaboom is a Stage 2 Pokemon with 170 HP. That actually makes me really happy to see Stage 2 Pokemon being able to, tank a little bit better now in this new era of the game. But anyways, has an ability, says once during your turn, you may search your deck for up to 2 grass energy cards and attach them to one of your Pokemon, then shuffle your deck, and it just has kind of a vanilla sort of bad attack. 3 grass, 1 colorless does 140, but of course the ability is really going to be the kind of centerpiece of the conversation here. But Zach, I know you had some thoughts on Rillaboom, so I'll pass this one to you. How do you feel about this guy?
So I think that Rillaboom's pretty cool. A lot of people are looking at it and they're like, it's a spiritual Vikavolt that we saw. We saw a lot of success with Vikavolt in the past with Vikavolt Tapu Bulu. I know we've already gone over a couple V Pokemon where it's like we got Dhelmise V, we got the Celebi V, and it could power up those Pokemon, and we did bring up those points. But is there anything better? And we've been looking through other Pokemon because even though Sword and Shield is released, we could still play with GX Pokemon and Tag Team GX Pokemon. So some interesting Pokemon that never really had the support to power them up would be like Venusaur and Snivy GX. So you could use Forest Dump, or maybe you could go off with a early Solar Plant GX. But the best way that Eric and I probably discuss to power up this Pokemon is with Rowlet and Alolan Exeggutor GX. So when Roweggs was released at the very beginning, a lot of players tried it with Serena that could individually power it up. But in this case, you could go Super Growth, whenever you could use Super Growth, get a Rillaboom out, and then next turn you could attack with Calming Hurricane. Then you could go Tropical Hour GX and actually get off the GX attack because you could power up from your deck, and then you could shuffle all of your opponent's energies away. So Rowlet Eggs might grow to become a little bit better as an attacker from Rillaboom, because Rillaboom is never going to be the attacker unless they release a way to make Rillaboom an attacker. But it seems like we can pair it with some strong grass Pokemon, Row Eggs being the best.
Yeah, and there's a couple of other things too. I definitely think those are some of the big ones that you already mentioned, Zach. But we still do have Rayquaza GX still lingering around in the format, which previously saw play with Vikavolt. So if you guys are Rayquaza GX fans and you've been waiting with bated breath for the chance to play Ray again, this is probably your best chance coming up. Now, granted, I'm not sure if Ray is as good as it once was, just because we now have tag teams and now VMAX Pokemon in the mix, and it can't as easily take the one shots that it used to back in its prime. But nevertheless, I mean, it's still a way you can play it, and there are some also colorless new VMAX and V Pokemon in this set, like the new Snorlax, that you can power up with Rillaboom if you choose to as well. So there's no shortage of partners for it, but I think the big downside to Rillaboom and just its typing right now is the fact that all of its attackers are just kind of like okay. None of them are particularly amazing. So I think while Rillaboom is a really good card in just a vacuum, in practice and looking at what exists in the current card pool for it, I think I'm going to remain a little bit more neutral. This is a card I actually could easily see seeing play as soon as they print maybe a better Pokemon V partner or something for this. But for the moment, I think the card's just kind of okay. I think we'll have to wait and see what other partners will get released for it. But I am very optimistic actually for the future of this card, just because grass Pokemon get printed every set, and inevitably there's going to be a strong Pokemon V that they will release to go alongside this. So that's kind of where I'm at, just kind of cautiously optimistic for the future of this card.
I totally agree with you on that. We've seen it in the past where it's just like it's one of those cards that just seems like it will be good at some point during its lifespan, as long as grass becomes a relevant type. And grass has been relevant since the beginning of the game. Even if you look in expanded, we saw that a Rao Eggs deck won. And powering up your Pokemon has never been a bad strategy. Energy acceleration is one of the strongest strategies in the game. So I would recommend, once the set is released, to pick up a playset of Rillabooms. There's a pretty good chance that Rillaboom will be played in the future heavily.
Next up, guys, we have another Stage 2 Grass Pokemon. This time it's going to be Orbeetle. Orbeetle has 130 HP, Fire Weakness, 1 Retreat. It has an ability. It says, once during your turn before you attack, you may look at the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck and put them back in any order. And then its singular attack for a Grass and Colorist is 90, plus 30 more for each Psychic Energy attached to this Pokemon. So there's definitely some good and bad to this card. I think going over the bad, this thing is pitifully weak for a Stage 2 in the Sword and Shield era. Like, we just went over Rillaboom that has 170 HP, and there's other Stage 2s in this set that have like 190. So this is definitely going to be on the weaker side of the Stage 2s in terms of health. And this attack is also pretty absurd. Like, I understand that it's part Psychic in the video games, so it makes sense that they would require Psychic Energy, or it's acceptable that they would require Psychic Energy, but the damage this thing's going to hit for is just nowhere near hard enough to consider this as an attacker. I think really the only selling point for Orbeetle is going to be the ability, and it's kind of similar to Chip Chip Ice Axe, but Zach actually brought this up to me. The big difference between this and Chip Chip Ice Axe is you get to rearrange the top 3 cards instead of just picking one and shuffling the others back. So this gives you a stronger control of your opponent's top deck than something like Chip Chip. But of course, the big downside is that this is a Stage 2 as opposed to just being an item card. So, I mean, I guess just, Zach, if we think about like the decks that play Chip Chip right now, I think the big ones are going to be like Pidgeotto Control, and also to maybe a lesser extent, something like Breaksard Control, which saw a little bit of hype at the beginning of the Cosmic Eclipse era. But I mean, I think those are really the only 2 big ones I could think of right now that would want to play Chip Chip. And so for me, I'm thinking, would this replace Chip Chip in those decks?
When we were originally talking about this card, we were like, how do we make this work? And I was like, okay, we got to play it with like Lieutenant Surge, Jesse James, Mars. So it's going to be a very similar strategy to like Pidgeotto Control, where it's like you are going to control your opponent's hands. They have 0 cards, and then you start controlling their top decks. And as we've seen over the past couple of years, Control has grown to become a very viable choice in the Pokemon TCG. The issue with this card is that it doesn't really change what Chip Chip does. So in the event of where like a card like Chip Chip Ice Axe gets rotated out of the formats, this could be a way to control your opponent's deck. The unfortunate downside of this card is that it's a Stage 2 Pokemon. If this was a basic Pokemon, it'd be instantly better than Chip Chip. But if you're playing a deck like Pidgeotto right now, and Pidgeotto currently runs up to 2 copies of Chip Chip Ice Axe, this would require at least a 1/1/1 Orbeetle line, or it would require a 1/0/1 with a rare candy in the deck. So it not only does it require an extra space, if you prize any single one of those pieces, then you can't use the effects of the ability as much like at all. So for me, I don't necessarily think that there's going to be anything out there that's going to be coming that we're just not thinking of right now. But it's one of those things where in the future, if Chip Chip Ice Axe doesn't exist, this does give you a Chip Chip Ice Axe like effect. It is better than Chip Chip Ice Axe. It's just a little bit more difficult to pull off. It might see no play ever. It might end up becoming one of the best cards in the game. There's no in between. There's no way to determine it. It's only going to be depending on what happens in the future of the game.
I'm right there with you. I think for that reason, I'm going to actually commit to saying this card is bad. It'll be a long time before the game rotates the Sword and Shield forward. So a lot can happen in that time. So we'll have to see. But I think for the moment, this card probably won't see any play. Alright guys, next up we have another Pokemon V that is going to be Torkoal V. Definitely not a Pokemon V I expected to see get printed in the game, but this is, much like the others, a basic Pokemon with 210 HP, water weakness, 4 retreat cost. It has 2 different attacks here, so 2 fire and a colorist is 90, and you discard the top card of your deck, and if you discard a fire energy, this attack does 90 more damage. And then its second attack for 3 fire and a colorist is 120, and you discard 2 energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. So I think there is actually a lot of support for this card. Obviously, it's fire, so it gets access to the insane suite of different fire support with Fire Crystal, Welder, and all the other different fire attackers. Has a 4 retreat cost, so you can search this thing out with things like Pokemaniac and use buff padding. Has no abilities, so you can use greens with this thing. There's the new Oranguru that will allow you to manipulate your top deck to get consistent use out of the first attack. And so you can get this thing up and running, but if you're a fire attacker, you really have to be a extremely good attacker to actually kind of cut through the noise, just because when you have to compete with things like Blacephalon GX, Reshizard, Breakzard, etc., you have to be insanely strong for people to choose playing you over these other cards. And Zach, I'd say I don't think Torkoal is the one to do that. It has plenty of support, and I think you can build around it, but I think there's just other fire Pokemon that probably will get you a dub quicker than Torkoal V.
And I completely agree with that. Even adding on to the non-fire Pokemon, we even have Mega Lopunny as a colorless attacker. We have Mega Mewtwo that can copy any attack in the game that's going to be running off the same suite of cards, like the Welder engine. I know you brought up discarding 2 cards is cool. For me, I want to discard 6 when I knock out something. And it's just playing at some regionals, I've played a lot of fire decks. And it's when I knock out my opponent's Pokemon with 6 energies on it with a fire type Pokemon, I'm like, yeah, I'd rather discard 6 for 3 energies instead of discarding 2 for 4 energies. So I don't think Torkoal V is going to be there. Now, it could be one of those cards in a year where there's a Torkoal VMAX. Could see some kind of merit here, but we'll never know if those cards are being released until we see some translations or some scans there. So for me, I'm going to give Torkoal V. I'm giving it the pass right now. I don't think it has what it takes. It is a cool looking card though. Torkoal is an awesome Pokemon. I'm not feeling this one here.
Yeah, I think the numbers it hits for are really the big issue here. So the first attack hitting 180 is actually fine. You 2-shot anything in the format, so it is a decent amount of damage to hit for. But again, with all the other different fire attackers that can attack for 3 energy, this is one of the weaker attacks out there. And the second attack, if this was 3 fire energy in 120, discard 2, I can get behind that because you can power it up all at once with Welder. And discarding 2 energy is, I think, a really impactful effect. I think that's not to be undersold, especially when you think of Crushing Hammer is discard 1 energy on a coin flip. That kind of tells you how strong removing just a hard discard is. So if this was 3 energy, I would be more convinced. Or if this was 4 energy and it did 160 or 170, then you could 2-shot anything in the format, including VMAXs. Then I think maybe my tune would change a little bit. But I think the numbers it hits for just are not there. And like I said, despite all the support and it being not really a terrible card in a vacuum, it just doesn't have what it takes to compete with the existing other ridiculous fire Pokemon in the format. So as you can tell from me, I'm also not a big fan, but cool for Torkoal fans out there. They've never had a Torkoal ultra rare up until this point, so I'm sure they will be excited to see this card. But from a competitive point of view, it's definitely not very good. Next up, guys, we have another fire Pokemon V. This is going to be Victini V. Victini V is, of course, a basic Pokemon. This one has 190 HP, so a little bit on the lower side in terms of some of the Pokemon V we've looked at, but water weakness, 2 retreat costs, has 2 different attacks here. The first of which, for a colorless energy, has Spreading Flames. You attach up to 3 fire energy from your discard to your Pokemon any way you like. And then its second attack, Energy Burst, for 2 fire energy, does 30 times the amount of energy attached to both active Pokemon. There's a couple of things that are kind of cool here. I mean, we do have Welder, so you can easily slap some energy down on this thing and do at the very least 90 damage with Energy Burst. And this is basically just Gardevoir GX's attack. And Gardevoir GX was one of the most dominant cards for the longest time whenever it was first printed in Burning Shadows. Granted, I definitely don't think this is perfectly analogous to Victini because Gardevoir could accelerate energy to itself. The total HP cap was a lot lower at the time. It had double colorless energy as well. So, like, I don't think this is honestly a very strong attack. But then its first attack is also pretty interesting, just attaching 3 fire energy from discard to your Pokemon any way that you like. But I feel like my issue with this card is there's already other cards that do stuff like this. So if you're playing a fire deck, especially like a greens deck, since this doesn't have an ability, you can already just play Volcanion and accelerate 3 energy with Flare Starter if you're going second, and you only give it 1 prize. So that seems a little bit better to me. Now, I mean, Energy Burst can take some knockouts on certain things in the format, especially with Zacian V looking to be very hyped from this set. Energy Burst could probably make quick work of a card like that. But generally speaking, any fire Pokemon can do that, and you don't necessarily need a Victini V to do so. So, Zach, I mean, I hate being so negative about a lot of these Pokemon V we've looked at, but this is just another one that just it's not like a terrible card by any means. Like, these attacks I think are perfectly serviceable and has support, and there are Pokemon that you'd want to power up with this attack, but I feel like there's just other stuff that already does that already, like Volcanion. We also have Mewtwo Mew that can use Solgaleo GX's attack to accelerate fire energy while also getting damage on the board in the process. So, I mean, you can see I just don't know what to think about this, other than it's just kind of lackluster.
Well, I think Eric, I think what you have there is very much what I'm on the same page as, where it's like a lot of these new V Pokemon, they're not necessarily strong right now. If there's a Victini VMAX ever, we would get maybe there's a way to copy the energy burst attack, put a triple acceleration energy if you could evolve it. So there are ways that I think Victini V could be cool if there's another Mewtwo Mew where you could copy V out of the discard piles. Something like that could be interesting, but could be doesn't necessarily get the job done. So with Volcanion being able to search your deck, not even your discard pile, because that's the first issue with fire spreading is that you have to need to get the energies out of your discard pile. Energy Burst could be good, but I think it's necessarily only going to be if there's going to be fire weak Pokemon in our format. I know we went over expanded a little bit. This could be a Pokemon that could abuse counter energy. However, I do feel like there could be better Pokemon in that format. I know, Eric, you were saying that there might be some other Victinis that are slightly better or can do a similar amount of damage that are not worth 2 prize cards. I think this card's probably better than some of the V Pokemon we've reviewed so far and some of the ones that we've looked up. However, I would look at your other available options because there might be something better, especially with the GX suite of Pokemon.
Next up, guys, we have actually one of my personal favorite Pokemon that we're going to be looking at in this set review, and that's going to be Cinderace. Cinderace is a Stage 2 Pokemon, has 170 HP, Water Weakness, 1 Retreat cost, and has an ability here. It says, once during your turn, when this Pokemon moves from your bench to your active spot, you may attach up to 2 Fire Energy cards from your discard pile to this Pokemon. And then its singular attack, Flare Striker for 2 Fire and a colorless is 190, and you discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. So, guys, this is like my ideal sort of card I like to see printed. It's a Stage 2 that can set itself up. You don't need like additional energy acceleration beyond what its ability already grants you. It's pretty girthy, has like 170 HP, which is pretty nice for just a single prize Stage 2. And 190 is a decent amount of damage. You can 2-shot anything in the format right now. And it's an excuse to play rare candies, so you know we have to like it to some extent for that. But yeah, I was kind of gushing to Zach about this card off cam. I'm a really big fan of this thing because this ability gets you 2 fire energies already, and then you just need 1 more attachment for turn, which means you can play things like recycle energy as well to have like kind of an infinite loop of energy, much like we've seen with Malamar decks. And basically, I mean, the big challenge with this card is you do have to have it on your bench and become your active, but we already have Jirachi, which is like the best pivot Pokemon in the game. So every time a Cinderace gets knocked out, you can just promote a Jirachi, set up your next Cinderace and retreat into it and start swinging. But then, of course, this is a fire Pokemon, so you even have other things like Heat Factory, Giant Hearth, etc. to throw energy away if you need to. And so I just think there's a lot of support for this card. I'm a really big fan of this. This is definitely a card I've already proxied up, and I plan on covering it on the channel for sure. Zach, I could probably like take over and dominate this entire discussion for this card, but I'm going to pass this over to you. That way you can get a word in on it before I keep rambling on about it.
So Eric likes Cinderace. I like Cinderace too. Probably not as much as Eric because he definitely likes those Stage 2 Pokemon, as you've probably seen on the channel. I like Stage 2 Pokemon too. I think this Pokemon's pretty cool because the 190 damage is a decent bit, and especially as a single prize card Pokemon, it seems like it can do some decent damage to those bigger Pokemon. We're still going to be dealing when the set drops with tag team Pokemon, normal GX Pokemon, and I think Cinderace might be able to get there. So in my head, I'm feeling like this looks like it almost looks like you're going to build it like a current ability Zard deck list. So with Giant Hearth, Fire Crystals, Ninetales, Jirachi, Switch, a skateboard, and then you can continuously hit for 190. So you want to know what? I think Cinderace might have a place in our metagame. The only thing that worries me about a card like this is that there's Malamar coming. Malamar has been a deck for a while, and Malamar can use Giratina and another spell tag, and it even has Distortion Door, so it might be able to take down a Cinderace quicker than Cinderace can take down a Malamar deck. Cinderace seems like it's going to be another one of these kind of single prize card attacking decks that will see some success, but it might not have the best Malamar matchup. So depending on where Malamar is in the format currently, when we're making this video, Malamar is one of the most played decks in the format. But if that changes for any reason, Cinderace might have its time to shine. If I'm building this deck, I probably want to build it as basic as possible. Like I said, I think an Ability Zard-like build seems like it'd be great for this, especially if you just replace some of the attacking Pokemon with Cinderace, and then having a Heatran GX to kind of get use of the ability. Beyond that, I don't know. I think this card's just good in general. Probably one of the best cards I've seen so far in the Sword and Shield set review.
Well, also, too, there's a few other things didn't even mention. We do have to get energy in the discard pile, and luckily, Sword and Shield actually gives us some pretty reliable new ways of doing that. So, I mean, of course, we already have Giant Hearth and Heat Factory, but we also, of course, are getting Quick Ball, which is one of the saviors of this format, which will allow us to discard energy and get out our basic Pokemon a little bit easier. But we also get a new Cinccino as well, which is essentially just trade on a one prize stage one. So that's another efficient way you can dump energy while also, giving yourself a little bit of extra consistency in the process. So I think Cinderace has a lot of support. Zach, I mean, you probably can imagine where I stand on this card. This is probably not like the best card in the set, but I think this is definitely one of my personal favorites, and I'm going to stand beside it. I think Cinderace is pretty solid.
I think I'm going to give it a solid as well. I could see myself definitely running this at least at a League Challenge, League Cup level, and then putting a little bit more testing and see if I want to be running it at an international, regional level. So I'm going to give it a good as well. I think it's going to become better with age.
Next up, guys, we have a Centiskorch we're going to be looking at. Centiskorch is a Stage 1 Pokemon, has 130 HP, 3 retreat cost, water weakness, has 2 different attacks here, the first of which is just going to be for a fire energy, and you discard a card from the top of your opponent's deck for each fire energy attached to this Pokemon. And then its second attack for a fire and 3 colorless is 110, and your opponent's active is now burned. Let's quickly get this out of the way. I don't think this second attack is very good. Granted, you can power this thing up with just like a welder and a triple acceleration energy, but as we've kind of talked about with some of these other fire Pokemon, if you're a fire Pokemon, you really have to be exceptionally good for people to want to play you over other cards like Reshizard, Blacephalon, etc. And this attack just is nowhere near good enough for people to choose this. I think really for the heart of this discussion, we have to look at this first attack, and it's a mill card, which is kind of cool. We have control decks in the current format, but not really any designated like mill Pokemon in this way. So I think this first attack is actually pretty unique in the current format. So obviously, if you just go Welder 2 energy attach, you can mill 3 from your opponent's top deck, which is fine. And then there's other cards beyond that, like Lieutenant Surge, since you're going to be behind on prizes. That will allow you to play maybe multiple Welders in a given turn, or even like a Welder and a Belba Bryson Man, which kind of achieves a similar effect in that same regard. But I'm just not convinced if this is the most efficient way to stall or mill your opponent, since we have Pidgeotto Control, which is a solid deck, as well as a Doll Stall. I think both of these decks are going to be a little bit more consistent in their strategy, just because Centiskorch is going to be continually getting knocked out. You're going to continually need another Centiskorch and a Welder every turn, or some combination of Welder, Belba Bryson Man, etc. to really keep your mill strategy going throughout the course of a game. So I mean, that's where I'm kind of at with this card. I think this card's cool. I was telling Zach, I actually think this card would probably skyrocket in playability if we still had Wishful Baton in the format. So if we ever get a Wishful Baton reprint and you're able to just keep bouncing your energies from your knocked out active to your next Centiskorch, that would make this card substantially better. But as it stands right now, like I feel like the other existing stall options are probably just a little bit stronger.
I think I definitely agree with that. Basically, the only way that we're looking at this card doesn't have a lot of HP, doesn't have very great attacks, but Flame Spread is the better of the two attacks. So if we're trying to break that attack, we got to look at ways that we can attach energies. As you already said, we have Welder in our format, and if you don't know what Welder does, you haven't been playing Pokemon in the past like year. Welder's been amazing. Attach two fire energies, and you can still attach one for your turn on top of drawing three cards. So looking at this card, we might be able to add Embor into it to power up more energies. The Embor that's coming from Cosmic Eclipse. So look at the top 8 cards of your deck, attaching the energies. So that might be able to get us a whole bunch, especially if we played a bunch of fire energies. In the expanded format, we get Blacksmith. We also get Kiawe. So those might be some other ways to power up some fire energies. But I think that's generally going to be it. The issue is the way that I look at this card, with one Welder, you're discarding 3 energies, and that's wasting your supporter card for the turn. Even with Lieutenant Surge, getting one more supporter after playing the Lieutenant Surge, I'm not entirely sure if I'd want to be playing this deck, because I'd rather be playing Lieutenant Surge, Bryson Man, to discard the top 6 cards of my opponent's deck, because I think I'm going to get a little bit more value out of there. So in a world where cards like that don't exist, or they don't exist together in the same format, or even as we talked with Orbeetle, similar, like if a card were to get banned from our standard format, which would be huge, it might be an interesting way if Bryson Man were to get this banned from our format. This would be a way to discard cards off of our opponent's deck. Beyond that, I think this card is not going to see much play right now. Like I said, unless there's a ban, even then, it's probably not going to see as much play as I'd like it to.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, man. I don't think this card's very good right now. It's definitely a card that could change in viability. Like I said, if we had a as simple as a Wishful Baton reprint, I think that instantly makes this card a consideration to be played. But for the moment, it's just a much clunkier way of milling and controlling your opponent than we have right now. So again, I really don't think it's a god-awful card, but there's just much better options that just shut this out of the game as a result. Alrighty guys, so next up we have our first Pokemon VMAX we're going to be looking at. That is going to be a Lapras VMAX, but of course before we get to that, we do briefly need to go over what Lapras V does. So Lapras V is a basic 210 HP. As first attack for a colorless, you attach 1 water energy from hand to this Pokemon, and then you switch with one of your bench Pokemon, and its other attack for 3 water and a colorless does 210, and you return 2 water from this Pokemon to your hand, lightning weakness to retreat cost. And then for Lapras VMAX, this is the first VMAX card we are going to be looking at. So if you guys aren't too familiar with these cards, they are the new 3 prize Pokemon. They're essentially just Pokemon V that can evolve, but they give up 3 prizes. And, you know, they get beefier attacks, beefier HP, etc. So Lapras VMAX has an astounding 320 HP. Absolutely insane. But much like with the other Lapras, this one does have lightning weakness. This one has 3 retreat, and it just has 1 singular attack here. Gmax pump for 3 colorless energy does 90, plus 30 more for each water energy attached to this Pokemon. So obviously the big card that people are talking about pairing with this is going to be the new Frosmoth, which we're going to discuss in detail a little bit later. But Frosmoth essentially lets you attach as many water energies to your bench water Pokemon as you would like. And so the big combo they're pushing here is Lapras VMAX, since it has this unlimited damage cap with this attack here. So if we just quickly run through the math for Lapras VMAX really quick to know where this card stands. If we have just 3 energies to fulfill the base cost, we're hitting 180, which is fine. But if we want to one-shot any of the tag teams, we're going to need 6 energy to hit 270. And then we're going to need a little bit more if we want to one-shot VMAX Pokemon. So, Zach, I'm actually going to pass this one to you. This is our first Pokemon VMAX. I know both of us have been a little bit underwhelmed by, in general, some of the Pokemon V. How do you feel about Lapras VMAX, though?
I'm happy that we have a card that I can actually like see myself playing. Like you said, pairing it with Frosmoth, and we got Lapras V, 210. Cool attack. 210's nothing to scoff at all, especially if you could power it up in one turn. Then we got the VMAX, where it's like you could swing hard and you could knock out anything you want in the game. I've been a huge fan of cards like this. I'm more in favor of big attacking basic or semi-basic Pokemon. I don't know how I want to call these Pokemon. They're evolution Pokemon, but they're not really.
They're not technically like a stage one though, but effectively they are. But they're
Right, where
not
it's just
technically
like I'm
considered.
improving upon the Lapras V. I can't use any attacks like a break Pokemon, but I can. I kind of know Gmax Pump is better than whatever Lapras V has coming on. And this Pokemon is 320 HP. So, however we want to call it, we're powering up this Lapras VMAX, and it can swing for a lot of damage. So far, this is the highest HP Pokemon we've seen in the set review. There are some other VMAX that have a lot of HP as well, so you might need to have a lot of energy. So if you're building a deck with this, do keep the amount of energies you need to attach in mind to your Pokemon and have ways to get them back as well, because you don't want your opponent to swing you back with a Lapras VMAX. We will be going over Frosmoth separately in this review, but I do think that Lapras VMAX is probably one of the best ways to just like load it up as a big, beefy attacker, swinging for a lot of damage. I don't know, Eric. I really like this card. I think it's probably the best VMAX card we've seen so far. Maybe it's the best one in the set. What are your final thoughts on it?
Well, even in terms of like specific card combos first, I think there's still a lot we should kind of point out here about both the V and the VMAX. So one thing I actually kind of like here with the V specifically is you could play something like Lily's Pokédoll, just because you need something to pivot into with Lapras V. And also, since Frosmoth only accelerates energy onto the bench, Lily's Pokédoll is also a potentially cool pivot Pokemon as well, since you can just throw it back in deck. Water also has a good bit of ways to recycle energy right now. Of course, we have Misty and Lorelei, so we can search a lot of energy out of our deck that way. We have Energy Spinner. We have Fisherman still in format, and we actually are getting energy retrieval reprinted in this set as well. So we have tons of ways to accelerate and keep this energy in play throughout the course of a game here. I think this is definitely one of the better cards we've looked at so far. I'm definitely in agreement. I think this is a good card. You know, without Frosmoth, we wouldn't be having this conversation at all, probably. But since Frosmoth exists and all of the different ways to keep energy in play and search energy out, I think that makes Lapras VMAX a pretty strong force to be reckoned with. We've seen cards like Blacephalon GX with unlimited damage caps perform well, and of course we've seen other cards in the past like the old Keldeo EX with a similar style attack perform very well for that same reason. So I see no reason why Lapras VMAX wouldn't follow suit. It has the support it needs to get up and running. So yeah, I'm a big fan of it. So next up, guys, we have another Pokemon V, and that is going to be Keldeo V. Keldeo V is a basic Pokemon, 210 HP. Two different attacks here, the first of which, Wave Splash, is going to be for a water energy, just does 40 damage, and then its second attack, it's going to look very familiar. It has Secret Sword, much like the old Keldeo EX, but this one is a little bit stronger. So for 3 colorless energy, does 50, plus 30 more for each water energy attached to this Pokemon, whereas the old Keldeo EX was only 20. So that might lead you to believe, well, this is stronger than that card, and Keldeo EX saw a ton of play, so isn't this good? And I would say maybe caution that line of thinking. While this is stronger than Keldeo EX, I don't think this hits the numbers that it needs to quite as strong as Keldeo EX previously did in its respective format. And it's almost like kind of unfair to this card that it got printed in the same set as Lapras VMAX, just because Lapras VMAX is essentially going to hit for 40 damage more than this. And granted, it does give up an additional prize, and you do have to evolve into it. But I feel like the numbers that Lapras hits for are a good bit better than this. And like, obviously you just pair this with Frosmoth. This is another card you can consider for that deck. But I have to say, I think I would just prefer to take the extra turn to evolve into Lapras VMAX and just guarantee that you nuke anything in the format. Just because if you want to one-shot an opposing VMAX, if you're playing like 10 or 11 energy in your deck, or maybe 12, you're going to need almost every single energy in your deck if you want to one-shot something like a Snorlax VMAX or a Lapras VMAX, as an example. So that's why I'm just like, I don't know how I feel about this Keldeo. I know I've been a little bit pessimistic about this one, Zach, but how do you feel? Like, are you playing this in like a Frosmoth deck as opposed to Lapras VMAX or alongside of it?
The only way that I could see myself playing this card is if I'm worried about Lapras VMAX being worth 3 prize cards instead of Keldeo V being worth 2 prize cards. Because Secret Sword is the same attack as what we got going on Lapras VMAX, but, and that's a key but, we're doing 40 less damage right from the get-go. So we're doing 40 less, so that basically means we're going to have 1 to 2 more energies to get the same effect as Lapras VMAX. However, it is worth 1 less prize card, so if you are trying to do some kind of prize trade game where you shove up a Lapras VMAX in your opponent's face, then you attack with a Keldeo V, then you send up another Lapras VMAX, that's all good. However, I think with a deck like Lapras VMAX, you're probably trying to set up just Lapras VMAX because it has the extra HP to withstand that extra prize card. It's chilling at 320 HP compared to 210. So the Lapras VMAX is fairly efficient when it comes down to that. I think Keldeo V, it's just in the shadow of a better card. So I don't think it's going to see too much play, but it might see play as a one-of card just because it's a very similar attack worth 1 prize card. I'm ultimately between this card as a fringe playable card to a non-playable card. I think Lapras VMAX and Frosmoth are probably better partners, and there might be other Pokemon that are better to even power up with Frosmoth too, so we'll jump into that if we can see Frosmoth later on in the set review.
I'm going to be a little bit more negative. I think this card's pretty bad. Again, if we didn't have Lapras VMAX, this would be, I think, a bigger consideration. So even though Keldeo in a vacuum is not a terrible card, I'm still going to downvote this just because there are better options, whether it's Lapras VMAX, whether it's Keldeo GX, whether it's Blastoise Piplup GX, or even some of the one-prize attackers that still exist. I think I'm going to pick pretty much all of those over Keldeo V, so not a big fan for me. Alright guys, next up we have the last of the Galarian starter evolutions. This is going to be Inteleon. Inteleon is a stage 2 Pokemon, has 160 HP, lightning weakness, 1 retreat cost, and it has this ability, Shady Dealings. Whenever you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, during your turn you may search your deck for up to 2 trainer cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. And it does have just 1 attack, has Aqua Bullet for a water and colorless. There's 120, and this attack also does 20 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. And before we get too deep into the discussion, I actually do want to quickly highlight Drizzile. Drizzile actually has a very good ability as well. It's very similar to the Inteleon one, but instead of searching for 2 trainer cards, you search your deck for 1 trainer card. But very good ability for just one of its stage 1 pre-evolutions. So I think I want to go over the good about this card. I think this ability is honestly insane. I think this ability is so good. We saw Alolan Ninetales GX dominate during the Lost Thunder format. It saw play in so many different decks just because you could evolve into it and get 2 item cards. And so this isn't 2 items, this is 2 trainers. That means you can get supporters if your hand is dead. That means you can get your stadium cards if you need to as well. This ability is just so flexible, and you're going to be able to grab essentially whatever you need. Just because even if you want Pokemon or energy, there's ways to get those out of the deck. So you can grab Energy Spinner if you need a trainer card to search for energy. You can grab a Quick Ball if you need to search for a Pokemon in some capacity. This ability is just so flexible and so very good, I think. But where I start to lose interest in this card is the numbers that it hits for. So hitting for 120 honestly wouldn't be terrible in the pre-rotation format where we didn't have Pokemon V and we still had Choice Band. But 120 just really isn't hitting the numbers that you need to. Like, granted, the 20 damage from Aqua Bullet can set up some math on some of the tag teams, but especially now that we have VMAXs in the mix, I think Aqua Bullet's just going to fall a little bit short. I was telling Zach, I really wish this attack was like 140, because then you could 2-shot all of the tag teams, and then, you know, you could still trade pretty well with the Pokemon VMAX, and maybe still like win modifiers, push your damage output high enough to maybe 2-shot a VMAX as well. So I think the damage output is just like really underpowered, and I think that's what might prevent this card from, I think, seeing play initially. Like Grant, Zach, I'm kind of talking in the context of like an attacking deck with Inteleon, but do you see any application for this outside of its own attacking deck?
I think it would have to be some kind of weird way to search cards out to set something else up. I kind of like looking at this card as like, I like fringe control decks, and that's really where my mind wanders with cards when I see them like this. So I know a lot of top players in Mexico City last year, they ran some kind of Ninetales Swampert deck, and it was in order to control what their opponent could do in play. So if you go from Drizzile to Inteleon, and you could evolve your Pokemon and continuously go back and forth, maybe there's a way to loop those cards continuously with, like, let's say, Moraine and Metal Energies, Mount Coronet, and a Devolution Spray of some kinds. I think that could be a cool concept. Or maybe even going a different route within being like, I'm going to use Bellaba and Bryson Man, not discarding your opponent's. Well, I guess it would discard your opponent's top decks as well. We could discard an Inteleon line to get it back. So maybe it'd be a cool way to get off like an unknown hand or get off some other amount of cards that you can continuously loop back and forth. That's kind of where I'm looking at it. I don't think its attack does enough damage, and I think that's where you're correct on the card. So I don't hate this card. I think it's really, really interesting, and it might grow as we get other Inteleons, or it might grow as we get some other cards. So it's definitely cards that I'm planning on picking up. I just don't know when they're going to be playable. I don't think day one that Inteleon's going to be this huge concept card, because we already have seen that we've had Alolan Ninetales GX in our format for a while now, and people have given up on that card. We might never see it being played, but I know personally I'm going to be picking up at least 4 Drizzile, 4 Inteleon, and you gotta love Sobble. Sobble is probably one of my favorite Pokemon that came out in Sword and Shield. Just as a Pokemon, it's in the middle for me.
And I think really if we ever get a choice band, like a pseudo choice band reprint that works for Pokemon V and VMAX, I think this card actually becomes much better, because that's really where I think it struggles, is the damage output. You know, if this was just like 30 more, that would, I think, push this card enough to where it could see some play. So for right now, it has a fantastic ability. It just doesn't quite have a home right now. So definitely in the middle, but this card certainly could improve as time goes on. Alright guys, next up we have the long-awaited Frosmoth portion of the set review. We kind of already did mention it a little bit with Lapras VMAX, but we'll go a little bit more in depth, specifically about Frosmoth in particular here. But the stage 1 Pokemon with a measly 90 HP, so definitely one of the weaker Pokemon we've looked at, Metal Weakness to Retreat, but it has a very, very good ability. It has the ability Ice Dance. As often as you like during your turn before you attack, you may attach a Water Energy card from hand to one of your benched Water Pokemon. So of course the comparisons that people have been drawing for this card are going to be with the old Blastoise back from Boundaries Crossed. And so of course Lapras VMAX is the big card that we're getting in this set that looks to be a partner for this, so we can just dump with Frosmoth a ton of energy onto Lapras VMAX and nuke everything in the format. That's essentially what we're trying to build around here. But even beyond that, I think there's other cards that we kind of might want to point out for the sake of this discussion. So some of the other important attackers I think that we still have in the card pool, obviously Keldeo GX, that's one of the most relevant ones in recent memory. Now granted, it remains to be seen how needed Keldeo is going to be once Sword and Shield comes out, because we don't know if Pokemon V are going to take over the format or if we're still going to have a lot of Pokemon GX and tag teams running around. But if GX is still to be very popular, Keldeo GX is an absolute consideration for whatever Frosmoth deck you want to run. We also have Blastoise Piplup GX that we got back in Cosmic Eclipse. You can now get that powered up much more effectively, and Blastoise has a pretty solid attack of its own to tank it and, you know, heal off a lot of damage. We have Volcanion Prism Star. There's also Palkia GX, the water type reprint that came out. One thing me and Zach were chatting about is, one thing that's important to point out is that your Pokemon VMAX don't have GX attacks. They're just normal attacks. So up until this point, Lapras VMAX as a deck doesn't really have a GX attack it might want to lean on. So Palkia GX actually has a very good GX attack to shuffle in all of your opponent's energy, and so that could be another potential one of. So one of the big downsides of Frosmoth compared to Blastoise is that this will only work for water Pokemon. So that means we can't play things like Mewtwo Mew. We can't play Snorlax VMAX, Megalophony, Jigglypuff. But as you can see, I think there's still a decent amount of normal water Pokemon we want to play. And then even beyond that, I think one card that actually might potentially make a little bit of a resurgence could be Dawnwing's Necrozma GX, just because you can only accelerate to bench Pokemon. And thanks to the new Air Balloon card we're getting in this set, your Dawnwing's Necrozma can always invade into the active spot and freely retreat out of there whenever it needs to. So I've been going on a good bit here, Zach. I feel like I've been dominating a little bit of this conversation. But is there anything else you think we might be missing for Frosmoth here?
For me, the Pokemon that I like the most is probably Palkia GX, because it does give you a solid GX attack in a Pokemon VMAX format that we're going to be joining into. One of the best Pokemon to power up with a Frosmoth is going to be a Lapras V or a Lapras VMAX. It's likely good to shuffle your opponent's energies in play. And then additionally, we get Misty and Lorelei. So while we're on the subject of Water Pokemon GX, we could pitch 5 from our hand and use our GX attack again in case our opponent does get set up from a Zero Vanish GX. Other good ones that I've seen with Misty Lorelei in some control decks are Articuno GX. So you could discard your opponent's energies from their active again, especially with a Lapras VMAX attaching upwards of 8-9 energies to it. With each set, Frosmoth will become better because we will likely receive strong water Pokemon that we can attack with. But Frosmoth is only as good as his partners. This is one of the must-buys from the set for me. Probably one of my favorite cards that I've seen in this entire set.
Definitely, like Zach said, I think one of the best cards in the set. And we have Misty and Lorelei. We mentioned when talking about Lapras. We also have things like Energy Spinner. We have Energy Retrieval getting a reprint in this set as well. I'm right there with you, Zach. I think this is for sure one of the best Pokemon we've looked at so far. Next up, we have yet again another Pokemon V we're going to look at, and that is going to be Tapu Koko V. It's a Lightning type Pokemon, 200 HP. Weakness to fighting, which is really interesting because we've seen Tapu Koko and all of the Tapus of the past, the GXs at least, have no weakness. So interesting to see this one get a fighting weakness. And it does have a 0 retreat cost and has no resistance as well. But 2 different attacks here. The first of which, Spike Draw for a Lightning Energy, does 20 damage and you draw 2 cards. And its second attack for 2 Lightning and a Colorless does 200, and during your next turn, this Pokemon can't attack. So I actually have to say, this is probably one of my more favorite of the Pokemon V we've looked at so far. For a few reasons. So this is, I think, squarely a card you would consider for Pikarom. But if you look at the attackers in Pikarom, nothing in the deck has a base damage output of above 200. And the only thing that does is going to be Pikarom's Tag Bolt, which is your GX attack. So Tapu Koko V, its base damage caps out at the same as the other 3 prize attackers, whereas this only gives up 2 prizes. And of course, you do have to remember we do have all of the lightning support with things like Electropower in the format, Thunder Mountain, Tapu Koko Prism Star, etc. So you can actually scale Thunderous Bolt up pretty high to one-shot opposing tag teams. VMAXs are going to be a little bit harder to one-shot. You probably won't. But Thunderous Bolt is pretty good against the existing 2 and 3 prize Pokemon that have come out prior to Sword and Shield. And Spike Draw, I actually think it is a pretty solid attack as well, especially if you look like you might whiff the turn 1 full blitz. Spike Draw, I think, is actually a perfectly fine attack to just lead the game with. Just draw 2. 20 can scale up a little higher with E-Powers, especially against like single prize decks with pre-evolutions like Inkays or maybe Jirachis. Spike Draw can pick off some of those low HP Pokemon sometimes. So I actually think this is a pretty solid one of in Pikarom. Zach, I know originally you weren't too enthused about this. Have I sold you at all on this one?
Like originally, like Eric, I was just like, Eric, buddy, come on. Like there's no way this card's playable. It's literally like, would I ever want to attach energies? And he's like, well, like it's good against single prize card attackers. And I'm like, but it does 20 damage. He's like, yo, bud, there's E-Power. So I'm like, okay, you want to know what? You can start selling. He started selling me on it. And it's more and more, it's grown on me where in a format where Keldeo GX is a card that often spells doom for Pikarom decks, Pikarom would just be like, I have a Zapdos and I have a Tapu Koko Prism Star, and those are my only attackers. And sometimes I don't even run Zapdos. So you would just run through an entire deck of Pikarom with a Keldeo GX. Tapu Koko V is not a GX Pokemon, it is a V Pokemon. Therefore, its Thunderous Bolt can go through a Keldeo GX. I know in the competitive scene, Pikarom's playability has dwindled a little bit. It still sees some success here and there, League Cups, maybe a couple in the top cut of a regionals. Nowhere near what it used to be. But if Pikarom does kind of get a resurgence in play, or if you are a diehard Pikarom player, I do think Tapu Koko V is probably worth a spot in there. And it's not like even if you start with it, it's awful. It does have free retreat. And if you're ever in a rough position, you could draw some cards with Spike Draw. So Tapu Koko, probably just attack in Pikarom, like Eric said. I'm still probably going to put it at like a fringe, maybe a lower fringe playability, just because it's only playable in one deck right now. But it is playable at the very least.
I'm actually going to stand beside this card and say it's good. It's not like one of the best cards in the set by any stretch, but I think it's good enough to, like Zach said, just cut through and become like a one of Pikarom. It frees up space in the deck because right now we see some people in the existing Pikarom lists that are going around right now. They play things like Electros and like multiple power plants with Reset Whole Mars Shadow to get around Chaotic Swell, to try to plant Keldeos and one-shot them. So you don't necessarily even have to play all of these kind of like clunky ways of dealing with Keldeo. If, again, Keldeo remains to be a popular Pokemon, playing this instead frees up some deck space. And especially in the context of Keldeo, if ADP continues to play that, which I'm not even sure if it will necessarily, they actually can't return KO you, which is really good. So if you just have a switch, you can one-shot another Keldeo GX. So yeah, I'm a fan of this card. Like I said, I'm going to stand beside this one. Alrighty, guys. Next up, we have Boltund we're going to be talking about. So Boltund is a Stage 1 Pokemon, has 130 HP, weakness to fighting, and 1 retreat cost. Has 2 different attacks, first of which, for 2 colorless energy, does 50, and your opponent's active can't retreat during your opponent's next turn. And then its second attack for a lightning and 2 colorless, it does 90 plus 90 more if your opponent's active is a Pokemon V or Pokemon GX. Zach, I'm actually going to pass this over to you. I remember you had some strong thoughts.
This card does have some merit, but I think it needs some pretty specific circumstances. First and foremost, you need to be playing against V or VMAX or GX Pokemon. Swinging for 180 damage with Biting Bites seems cool, especially with a Welder or maybe a triple acceleration energy. Welder's probably a little bit more consistent. But if you're attacking against those type of Pokemon, you probably only need to get out 2-3 knockouts at most. And if you pair it with Electro Power and Electro Charger, with 3 Electro Powers, you can knock out most Pokemon. With 4 Electro Powers, you could probably knock out every Pokemon except for some juicy new VMAX Pokemon. But we do have other options with this card as well. Like, if you're facing against a Lapras V or VMAX, that Pokemon is weak to you. So I wasn't even factoring in weakness when it came to this. I was like, okay, cool, whatever, Electro Power here, Electro Power there. It's like, okay. I know that I won't be playing it. I'm sure Eric is, he's the one who wanted to mention the card, so I'll let him explain it a little bit more. But this card, if you're a fan of the Boltund, and I don't know why anyone would be a fan of Boltund, because it basically ruined Yamper for me, is a Pokemon.
Oh,
Yamper,
man, I like Boltund.
you like Boltund more?
I wouldn't say I like him more, but I like it.
Really, as soon as I almost cried in Pokemon Sword and Shield when I evolved my cute little Yamper into like a Boltund. I was like, this looks like a Disney movie dog instead of being a Pokemon. I'm sorry if I'm making all the Boltund fans upset. I just think that Yamper is a total cutie. So I'll pass it over to you, Eric. I know that you were the one who had a lot of thoughts on Boltunds. I'm not sold on the card. I think it's okay, but like it's okay bad. So League Challenge memes and stuff like that.
So, I mean, you kind of touched on some of the big things. You hit Lapras VMAX for weakness, and if you have a metagame centralized around Lapras VMAXing your local area, this could be like a decent like anti-meta pick potentially. 180 is actually a good amount of damage. You two-shot everything in the current format, and against GXs and tag teams, thanks to the modifiers that exist, you can actually scale up to where you need. And we still have things like Shrine. We even have the new Galarian Zigzagoon to ping 10 damage if you need that. There's Fine Band as well, Electric Charger. So there's ways to scale this damage output up. And Welder can power this thing up right away. I think you mentioned triple acceleration energy already, but I think Welder is probably just an easier way to go with this. Since you can just Welder 2 fire, attach lightning for turn, and be good to go. As you can see, there's a bunch of modifiers that exist across the board for a card like this. You're going to lose to Malamar, but it doesn't even matter if this attack would apply to Malamar or not. You're just losing to that no matter what. So I think it's like pretty irrelevant, the fact that this second attack is only for like 2 and 3 prize Pokemon essentially. So I think this card is kind of cool. I still wouldn't commit to saying it's good, however. I'm like kind of torn between giving it like a bad rating and being a little bit more neutral. Like a part of me wants to remain more in the middle just because lightning and fire both have a ton of support. And if you are playing Welder, that opens you up to playing additional Pokemon in your deck to maybe deal with certain matchups. Like that suddenly opens you up to playing something like Reshizard and there, or maybe like a Blacephalon GX or something like that. So you definitely have some flexibility there as well. I really want to stay neutral on this card, but I just have a suspicion that this card's probably not going to see too much play. Like we mentioned with some of the other fire attackers, out of all of the cards in the format that can abuse Welder, I don't know if you're picking Boltund over Reshizard, over Breakzard, over Mewtwo Mew, etc. So I think I'm probably going to commit to saying it's bad, not because it's a bad card, but just because Welder already enables so many more stronger options. So I like the card, and I might still actually try to cover it on the channel eventually. But yeah, I think it has a lot to compete with this play. Next up, guys, we have another Pokemon VMAX evolution line we're going to be looking at. This is going to be Morpeko and Morpeko VMAX. So before we get to the VMAX, we'll talk about Morpeko V, which actually might be the more interesting of the two. But this is a Pokemon V with 170 HP, so definitely one of the weaker ones so far. Fighting weakness, 2 retreat cost, and its first attack for a colorless energy does 20 and 20 more to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. And then its second attack for 2 lightning and a colorless does 150, and you discard an energy from this Pokemon, then switch this Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon. And then Morpeko VMAX has 300 HP, so it does get a pretty good buff when it evolves here. Fighting weakness, 1 retreat, and just 1 singular attack for 2 lightning and a colorless does 180, and then 20 to each of your opponent's Pokemon. So I think Morpeko VMAX, let's get this out of the way. I think this card is really, really bad. This is definitely one of the more uninteresting VMAXs we've looked at. But I think Morpeko V actually is a little bit more fun to look at, specifically in regards to the second attack. So 150, discard energy, but then more interestingly, you switch this Pokemon, meaning you can play something like Lily's Pokédoll to deny prizes and not give up 2 prizes with your Morpeko Vs. So I think that might be the way you could build around this. If you are intent on building around this evolution line, I think that is probably the way you're going to play it. You know, Pikarom is already a very strong archetype, so I don't think running effectively a stage 1 to do 180 is very good. So I don't think you're building around that. I think you're building around this like hit and run style effect. We have Tapu Koko Prism Star, we have Thunder Mountain, we have recycle energy in the format, so every time you discard an energy with Morpeko V, you can make it a recycle energy. That way you can just keep doing that every turn. So I mean, I think there are pieces to this combo that enable it to work. Now the question is that combo better than some of the other ones that exist? Like, is this better than Beheeyem, as an example, that already has a similar style engine? Is this better than Hitmonchan, as an example, which also does something like this? So, Zach, what do you think about Morpeko V here?
My issue with this is that it requires a lot of energies, and a lot of other hidden runs require only 1 energy. But with the ways that you could power up this Pokemon between the Tapu Koko, Prism Star, Bede, or just naturally attaching an energy, it seems pretty okay to me that you can get this off going within the first or second turn of the game. And then setting up either Lily's Pokédoll or Keldeo GX or something similar along to one of those lines. There's also Gumi. There's some options in our standard format that we can bring up. As much as Eric thinks that Morpeko VMAX is not great and wouldn't play it, for me, I'm actually on the opposite of it, where it's like if I'm playing Morpeko V, I think I'd like to play like at least 1 copy in the deck. So I could just do 180, so you're getting an extra 30 with Electro Power. It could give me the power that I need to knock out a VMAX Pokemon. So it seems pretty cool, and it could set up damage for my other Morpekos, if I am setting up any other Morpekos, to do 20 damage to everything. So I think it could be a cool card to add into a deck like that.
I think it's more of just like, you probably run 1 as a finisher, just so you get a little bit more damage with some E-powers to, you know, clean up your last 3 prize knockout or something like that.
That's basically where I'm at with the card as well. Overall, I think this card's okay. It's probably fringe playable, especially if it can be its own deck, but I'm not particularly a huge fan. I don't think it's the next best deck It's not an Arceus to Algapalkia. It's not a Pikarom. It's not a Blounds. It's nothing super obvious. So I think it's going to see very light play over time.
Yeah, I think overall I'm going to remain a little bit neutral on this. I mean, I think this card's just lucky because it has so much support in terms of all the great lightning cards that exist right now. I will say this too. One good thing about this compared to some of the other hit and run style cards we've talked about is that the damage on this is actually pretty significantly higher. Hitmonchan only hits for a 30 base amount damage, Beheeyem only hits for 90. So hitting 150 is a pretty significant upgrade and it does kind of make it worth setting up the additional energies to get this thing going. That being said, we've looked at a couple of strong cards already. I'm not sure if this is going to be able to stack up to some of the other ones we've been talking about and have yet to come in this set review, but I think there are enough pieces for this to work. How good it's going to be, I'm not so sure just yet, but I think I like this enough to stay kind of neutral on it. Next up, guys, we have Galarian Rapidash. Galarian Rapidash is going to be a psychic Pokemon with 100 HP, weakness to dark, fighting resistance, and 1 retreat cost. And its ability here, it says each of your Pokemon can't be affected by any special conditions. Remove any special conditions affecting those Pokemon. And then its singular attack for a Psychic and Colorless is 30, plus 30 more times the amount of energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So one thing I was actually very excited for when I saw that we were going to get a Rapidash is that we really haven't ever had a playable Rapidash in the history of the game as far as I can recall. And so I had my fingers crossed that we'd finally get one, but I can't say I'm that enthused about what we got here with Galarian Rapidash. You know, removing special conditions is pretty good. We've seen cards like this see play before, like Virizion EX for similar reasons, but I don't think special conditions are a big part of the game right now. I don't see much to indicate that that's going to change. And then this attack also isn't very impressive if we're not going to play this for the ability here. So I have to say, Zach, I'm struggling really where to place this Galarian Rapidash that we have here.
For me, it's one of those things where I think special conditions at times are better than other times, and I'm a little paranoid. So if special conditions ever become big, this is probably a go-to staple card because each of your Pokemon can't be affected by special conditions, and you remove them. And we've seen special conditions that vary from like the basic paralysis, stuff like that. A cool card that could work with this is Jirachi. You can never make it asleep, which means it can always retreat. So there are some fringe instances like that where I think this card could be cool. Maybe we could change the way that we build decks in general when it comes to Jirachi-based engines, playing a 1/1 Galarian Rapidash, or like if there's something like 8 times poison or 8 times burn, some crazy things like that that get released, or something that's automatically viable. It's something that Galarian Rapidash would still stop. I thought about expanded briefly. I feel like there has to be a better option to get around things like Shock Lock, but this could be a great way to just automatically win against that deck if you're worried about it. For those of you who do not know what Shock Lock is, it uses Raichu, I believe, from Burning Shadows to paralyze your Pokemon, and then they continuously loop it back and forth with de-evolving that Pokemon and continuously paralyzing your Pokemon while you can't play supporters to get around it. So getting around special conditions has been okay in the past, so it might be okay. I'm putting it more like likely on the less played bad side, but it is playable at the very least.
I'm actually going to commit to saying this card is bad. That's not to say it won't ever see play, but just the way the game is right now, special conditions aren't really relevant enough outside of your own Jirachis being asleep, I think, to really make a difference. But if we do get a big special condition powerhouse coming out in the future, Rapidash will certainly have to be on your radar at the very least. Next up, guys, we have a new Gengar. Gengar is, of course, a Stage 2 Pokemon. This one has 110 HP. So a little bit on the weaker side. We've been seeing the HPs start to trend upwards for the Sword and Shield era, but Gengar has actually kind of been nerfed from some of its more recent counterparts. So 110 HP, definitely on the lower side. Weak to dark, resistant to fighting, to retreat, but it has this ability which is very interesting. As often as you like during your turn before you attack, you may move a damage counter from one of your psychic Pokemon to another one of your psychic Pokemon. And then it has this singular attack for 2 psychic and a colorless is 90 and your opponent's active is asleep. So the attack, very forgettable. You're probably never going to really attack with this, but the ability is interesting, I think. It kind of harkens back to the Reuniclus all the way from Black and White, which actually did see a good amount of play. I think most famously in the 2011 deck, The Truth, the Vileplume deck that played Reuniclus and Reshiram and Zekrom, and basically just kept moving damage counters off these guys or just manipulating their damage counters to make sure stuff didn't die or they could hit the numbers that they needed to. So Gengar is very similar to that, but it is limited to just Psychic Pokemon, which definitely narrows the use of a card like this a lot more. And so if we're looking at this, I think we have to basically think, well, what are the Psychic Pokemon in the format that are actually big enough to take a hit and not die? And so I think some of the ones that are going to come to mind, for me at least, are going to be Mewtwo Mew, Muckalo and Muck, and maybe like Trevenant Dusknoir. I think those are some of the sturdier of the basic attackers that we have right now. And I just struggle to see where Gengar would fit into any of those decks, really. I think out of all of those, the ones I think sounds the best is actually a Muck, Alolan Muck, just because that card already has some degree of built-in healing. So if you're playing against a deck that can never one-shot you, you can move some of the damage off and heal the remaining with the attack on Muck, Alolan Muck. That's kind of where my head is at, and I don't know if you guys have been aware, but the Muck Muck tag team has not been the best card. So if your best application for Gengar is with that, then I start to lose a little bit of interest here.
I'll continue on with that, where I'm going to echo pretty much everything that Eric said. When we were looking over at ways that we could play this card, it's similar to Frosmoth. It's one of those cards where it is very specifically a psychic Pokemon. It's not any one of your Pokemon. So when I was thinking about ideas like, oh, maybe this would work with like the upcoming Snorlax VMAX or something like that, something with a lot of HP, I quickly realized that it was not a psychic Pokemon. So looking at the psychic Pokemon that we have with the most HP that we've seen so far, I know there's a couple more Pokemon V, like Wobbuffet V in the set and Indeedee V, but those Pokemon do not hit the high 200 range. They're very low 200 tier. We're looking at Solgaleo Lunala GX. We're looking at Espeon Deox, like things like that. And like Eric said, Muck and Alolan Muck is probably the best. I don't think Mewtwo Mew GX is going to be running a card like this. Gengar, while it seems like it does have a cool ability, and it is similar to Reuniclus, it's one of those cards that I think is going to be at the back of your binder. And until we get a psychic Pokemon that has like 300, 330, like anything like that, it just doesn't matter right away. Right now, it's honestly bad. But in the future, it could become fringe playable or even extremely playable, depending on which psychic Pokemon we have in our format. So pick them up if you are interested in the future of psychic Pokemon, or if you're a Gengar fan. Beyond that, I am probably going to pick these up and keep them at the back of my binder. I'll give it a kind of middle of the ground rating right now.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. For the moment, this card is bad, but the only reason that I'm going to remain neutral on this card is because inevitably they're going to be printing Psychic Pokemon V and Psychic Pokemon VMAX. So inevitably there's going to be Pokemon that could look to tank with this card. So for that reason, I'm going to remain neutral, with the caveat of that this card is probably still bad for the moment, though. Next up, guys, we have another Pokemon V. This is going to be Wobbuffet V. This is going to be a basic Pokemon, 220 HP, weak to dark, fighting resistance, and a 3 retreat cost. Has two somewhat interesting attacks, the first of which, for 2 colorless, you switch all damage counters on this Pokemon with those of your opponent's active Pokemon. And that second attack, for 2 psychic, the 70, and the defending Pokemon can't retreat during your opponent's next turn. So, I mean, the second attack's like kind of okay, but I think the more interesting one is probably the first one here. We've seen an attack like this in the past with the Mewtwo EX back from Breakthrough. Mewtwo EX did actually see a decent amount of play. Granted, Mega Mewtwo was also very good at the time, so that is, one reason for that as well. But nevertheless, we've seen an effect like this see some degree of success, so I definitely think there's merit to discussing this. Zach, I know you had some thoughts on Wobbuffet, so I'll pass this one to you, man.
Going over a card like this, we got to think of what ways do we have to power up our Pokemon. And we already have Malamar. It's already a tier 1.5 deck that's seen a lot of success so far, so it's a proven concept. So this is just basically an additional attack for a deck like that. I guess in Expanded, you could power it up with a double colorless energy, but I think in Expanded, they're going to just smoke the 220 HP Pokemon, and Wobbuffet won't even have time to step back. It won't even have time to see what's coming. It's getting hit by the bus. So Wobbuffet V in standard with Malamar could give you a pivot turn with step back if your opponent cannot hit for 220 damage. Situation that we talked about is mirror. You put up a Wobbuffet V, your opponent doesn't have any spread Pokemon in play to get around the Wobbuffet, so they're either forced to attack you or they are forced to pass their turn. Passing a turn in any match can be absolutely detrimental. And Shadowbind, another play that I thought of. Imagine if you win game one, time gets called, and your opponent has a Jirachi in the active position. You could actually trap the Jirachi with Shadowbind, 70 damage, minus 20 damage for resistance, 50 damage on the Jirachi, and then that Pokemon cannot retreat. So it does give you a way to kind of buy time. I guess in both situations, it just buys time. I don't necessarily think it's the best tech, but I do think there are some fringe possibilities that this card is acceptable. I don't think it's going to be an all-star card. I don't think it's going to be anything like that. I think it might do its job as a single one of tech in like a Malamar deck or something similar to that.
I'm just not nearly as excited about this card. Not that you're like jumping over the moon for something like this. It's one of those cards like I can see where the application for this could come up, but right now I'm just not seeing it. I'm not seeing that specific instance. So right now I'm actually going to commit to saying that this card is actually kind of bad. But nevertheless, I mean, don't underestimate how good this first attack can be. So if we're in a meta where it's about two shots and Pokemon aren't hitting 220 consistently, then I think you could consider the Wobbuffet. But right now, I'm just really not a big fan of this card, so I'm going to downvote it. But I would agree with Zach. It's not a bad card to have on hand just as like a one of. I think that's perfectly reasonable. Alrighty, guys. Next up, we have Polteageist. Polteageist is going to be a stage 1 with 60 HP in the year 2019 somehow. Like this thing isn't even like Pidgeotto where it evolves. This is the final evolution and has 60 HP. But at the very least, that does make this evolution line searchable by Professor Elm's lecture. That's something we have to keep in mind. But here has two different attacks, the first of which for a colorless energy, both players draw 2 cards. And the second attack for a psychic and colorless, your opponent reveals their hand and it does 50 times the amount of trainer cards you find there. So this actually looks very similar to a couple of other cards we've had throughout the course of the game. I think one of the more successful ones that comes to mind is going to be the Gengar back from Stormfront, I believe it was. Saw a lot of play for an attack very similar to this. Granted, Gengar had a strong ability to go with it as well, but nevertheless, the attack was still quite strong. And even more recently, we've had the Gengar and Mimikyu GX with essentially almost the exact same attack as Poltergeist here. So yeah, I do think there are some things to like about this. Like I said, Professor Elm's lecture is going to search out your entire evolution line. The attack cost is pretty low maintenance. Granted, it is 2 attachments, so you might need like a 1-1 or a 2-2 Malamar line in there just to ensure that you can always get your second attachment, but that's not too big of a deal. Professor Elm's lecture also searches out Inkays in addition to that. You can also get Ditto with lecture as well. And I think there's actually a good bit of cards to actually influence the amount of trainers that your opponent has in their hand. Zach, I'll actually pass this over to you. I remember you had some really interesting ideas for how to manipulate your opponent's hand size in this way.
Yeah, so when Eric and I were going over the set, we were talking about what could be played with this card, and I came up with the idea of running it with Blaine's Quiz Show. So I think it's a cool option where your opponent has a chance to guess the right card, but if they guess wrong, you're drawing 4 cards. If they guess correct, they're drawing 4 cards. The 4 cards could be 200 damage for them. Think about where 200 damage lands. 200 damage is quite a lot. That's most of the HP of any tag team Pokemon or of any Pokemon in the game.
And that's not even factoring any existing cards they have in their hand either.
Exactly. So if your opponent has 10 cards in their hand already and they're like laughing in the background being like, ha ha ha, I only got 3 trainer cards in there, you might be able to give them the extra few trainer cards you need to get the attack off for that gigantic knockout that you want. Furthermore, both Sinistea and Polteageist both have the Tea-Time attack, so even if your opponent tries to sneakily guess wrong, to try to avoid drawing 4 cards after they kind of figure out your deal with what's going on with the Blaine's Quiz Show, you can actually trick your opponent back or give them a higher percentage chance of getting it right, especially if they're trying to guess right. So it gives you an option there. Anyways, I think this card could be pretty cool, and it could see some play in the future. Whether, like Eric said, it's going to be a Malamar tech, or if it's going to be its own deck. Attacks like this over the history of the game have been quite strong.
So just to go over a couple of other card inclusions you could run if you're trying to build around Poltegeist, I really like the Blaine's Quiz Show idea. That's a card that is really under the radar. It's a card that's generally pretty bad, but in this case can be good. I think actually Erica from Cosmic Eclipse, I believe, is another card that also pretty bad normally, but could be good in this instance. Both players may draw 3 cards. So your opponent does have the option, but at the same time, it's still, if they choose not to draw, that's 3 cards they're not getting. So either way, it's not the worst. Though I do think the Blaine's Quiz Show is probably a little bit better. We do have Surprise Box still in format to put a trainer card back into your opponent's hand. We have Reset Stamp if they've played their hand down to like a very low size. We have the new Marnie supporter coming out in this set as well, which can influence your opponent's hand size. So I think there's actually a good bit of ways to build around this. But I do think the card does have some kind of inherent downsides. So thinking back to the old Gengar, it also had Vileplume at the time to lock its opponent's item cards. Now, granted, we have Amistar in the current format, but the issue with Amistar is you have to be playing a deck that has a very low bench size. And with a deck like this, I think you'd be operating at pretty much full capacity. So I don't think you can reliably lock your opponent's items with Amistar. And even beyond that, anything that can spread damage is just going to eviscerate this card. Just like in Espeon Deoxys, Cross Division GX can wipe out a Sinistea and a Poltegeist without even the fully powered version of the attack. Of course, we also have spell tags in format, Distortion Door on Giratina. So I think there are a lot of things going against this, but I have to actually say this is one of my more favorite like pet cards from the set, and I'm actually going to have an eye on it. I think this card for me is going to fall somewhere in the middle for now, but I think this attack is quite strong and there is a lot of support for it, and it might eventually do something. So I think I'm ultimately going to remain a little bit neutral on this one. Next up, guys, we have another Psychic Pokemon V, and that is going to be Indeedee V. It's kind of a hard name to pronounce there, but it's a basic Pokemon, 180 HP, weak to dark, resistant to fighting, and a 2 retreat cost. And it has this ability, Watch Over. Once during your turn, you may heal 20 damage from your active Pokemon, and then its only attack, Psychic, for a Psychic energy, and 2 colors does 10, plus 60 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So I think this card actually has some interesting things about it. I think both the ability and the attack have promise in different ways. So in terms of the ability, I think some of the more practical applications are going to be, let's say there's another deck in format that has to 2-shot your deck down to the damage counter or within 2 damage counters. You could potentially play one of these in DDVs to swing the exchange to force them to have an additional attack. Also, maybe a deck like Snorlax VMAX, as an example, might just want to play a bunch of these in DDVs and try to heal, 20, 40, 60, up to 80 damage every turn and just try to tank a bunch of hits that way. So I think both applications for this ability have some degree of potential. Now, in terms of the attack, Zach, what do you think about the attack?
I think the attack's pretty cool, depending on like how big energies are attached. And right now in our format, we have Welder Pokemon. We have just Pokemon have a lot of energies on them nowadays. If you look at things like Ability-Zard, Mewtwo Mew, and if you look at some of these other decks, like even Lapras VMAX with Frosmoth, that's looking to become a new deck. I think Indeedee V could be a pretty strong attacker just by getting all those Pokemon with energies on them. You're already punishing a Mewtwo for being Psychic type, and you don't have a Psychic type weakness, so you can knock out a Mewtwo as long as they have 3 energies on them. You can knock out a Lapras VMAX if they put too many energies on them. And it seems like this card could either be good on its own with a Welder, or it could be good as a strong attacker in a Malamar deck. I don't necessarily see how strong it's going to be with its ability, because usually abilities like that are better on Pokemon that are non-2 prize card attackers. But it's one of those things that I like the nice little bonus of Watch Over. I think this card's cute, and I'll probably add it into my Malamar list as I start testing the Sword and Shield format. Beyond that, it's one of those cards where it's going to be based off the format, so it could jump in and out of the format depending on what the metagame looks like at any given time. So I think this card's playable.
So I think I'm actually going to remain a little bit more neutral on this, because I'm thinking in the case of something like Malamar, if you're teching this in, against Lapras VMAX, this Psychic attack is really good, but if you're playing Malamar against Lapras VMAX, they're probably never going to commit enough energy for you to one-shot them, given how much HP your attackers of Malamar normally have. That's not to say you still wouldn't play it. It's still good against Mewtwo and Mew, but I would also argue that if you're playing Malamar, you already have ways to one-shot Mewtwo Mew, unless of course they get down like their weakness guard energy or something like that. Though if they do gear up for like a big cross division GX, like fully powered up, and they have like 5 energies and they're threatening it on their next turn or something like that, you can come in with a Psychic and just like nuke a Mewtwo Mew, which seems pretty cool. So even though I can see how there could be practical applications for this thing, I'm not sold on that I would actually commit to the space for this right now, because I'm thinking primarily in terms of Malamar. Though I guess you could play this as like a one of in Mewtwo Mew, since you're probably playing Psychic Energies already. Yeah, I'm just really not sure exactly where it fits in. It's going to be kind of in response to what is happening in the metagame, like Zach kind of already pointed out. So I think I'm going to remain neutral, but this is a card I would still say probably pick up at least one of, because I could easily see how this could start to see play as the format begins to kind of solidify. So I'm going to remain neutral on it, though I am a little bit optimistic for Indeedee. So next up, we have a new Claydol. Claydol is going to be a Stage 1 Pokemon with 120 HP, Grass Weakness, and 2 Retreat Cost. And it has 2 different attacks, the first of which is going to be Psybeam for a colorless energy does 30, and your opponent's active is now confused. And its second attack for 2 fighting energy does 200, and this Pokemon does 120 to itself. So I actually have to confess, I know back during our Sword and Shield first impressions video that I did, this was one of the cards I saw and immediately was like, oh, you just knock yourself out. This card is just blatantly bad. But what I hadn't seen at the time is there's actually a new Pokemon tool card in the set which will increase your max HP by 30. So after that, I kind of changed my tune on this card a little bit, because now you can basically do 200 and only give up 1 prize on your opponent's next turn instead of knocking yourself out. And so 200 is actually a pretty good amount of damage, I think, to hit for, given the type that Claydol is, because you can one-shot 2 of the different VMAXs coming out in this set, those being Morpeko and Snorlax. And with the existing damage modifiers that we have, you can actually climb up to one-shot a lot of the tag teams. I think maybe Arceus Palkia is going to be one of the trickier ones to kind of hit for a one-shot, but I think all the other ones, you can somewhat reliably climb up to those damage numbers. So just to run through some of the modifiers we have Diancie Prism Star, so that's going to bump us up to 220. Then from there we have Martial Arts Dojo, which will bump us up to 260. From there we have some other cards like Galarian Zigzagoon, or if you want a decent starter Pokemon for your Claydol deck, you could play the Baby Zygarde to get in some chip damage and accelerate some energies in the process as well. So between all of those, you actually can start to climb up in one-shot tag teams, and that's where I think makes this card a little bit interesting. Though I'm going to pass this over to Zach. I know you weren't quite as optimistic for the chances of this card succeeding, though.
Yeah, no, it's one of those cards where it's like, at first glance, 200 damage sounds pretty cool, but like, we're living in 2019 here, and soon to be 2020. It's one of those cards where it's like, what does 200 even knock out nowadays beyond single prize card Pokemon? So you either want to be playing against something that's fighting type weak, like a Snorlax VMAX, or a what's the other one? Morpeko VMAX, or one of the tag team like a Pikarom or a Mega Lopunny. But if you're not playing against those, it can be a little bit of a hike to get up to an Arceus Palkia. So we're talking like a whole like tower of stuff that you need to do and kind of Exodia God hand your opponent, in my opinion, where it's just like, in any reasonable game, I can barely get a supporter on my first turn, and I build my decks as consistently as possible. If you're asking me if I'm going to be able to get the fighting energy, even to get the Claydol out, and then on top of all of that, with not even having all this fighting support, get the Diancie, get the martial arts dojo, get all of these other little nooks and crannies that I need, I feel like the deck's just going to struggle to get those big knockouts, and that's where it's really going to count. Now, with the form, it does shift in the favor of fighting type weak Pokemon that are worth 2-3 prize cards. Yeah, I'll say that it's playable, but for right now, I think this card is just awful, and I'm going to leave it like that. If you have any more thoughts on it, Eric, that's cool. Other than that, I'm done with this card. Don't play
it. All right, so I'm not nearly as pessimistic as Zach is about this card. I'm ultimately going to fall a little bit closer to neutral on this thing. Because, again, you do one-shot some different popular Pokemon, like Pikarom, Snorlax VMAX, etc. And you can climb up high enough to hit non-fighting weak tag teams for one-shots. But as you kind of mentioned, Zach, this deck would be quite combo oriented, and it might be hard to get all of your combos every turn that you need them. And also, if you're going against any deck that really just plays some spreading options, like Spell Tag or even just an Espeon Deoxys and like Mewtwo Mew, something like that, then you're really just going to have a hard time. And I think that's really going to stifle the success of a deck like this. So while I think it has some good things going for it, I think it also would have some pretty big challenges to overcome as well. So I think just because of the sheer amount of modifiers that fighting has, I think is what's going to land me somewhere in the middle on this card. Next up, we have our first fighting Pokemon V. That's going to be Regirock V. This is a basic Pokemon with 220 HP. It's Grass Weak, 3 retreat cost, and just has 2 different attacks here. First of which is going to be a fighting, and a colorless is 30 plus 10 for every damage counter on this Pokemon. And that second attack for 2 fighting and a colorless is 190, and then this Pokemon does 30 to itself. So it kind of has Outrage that we've known and loved on Reshizard, and of course the old Reshiram and Zekrom cards from the black and white era as well. That just kind of a more stable, somewhat reliable 190 for the second attack, which can kind of two-shot pretty much most things in the format.
It's one of those cards where it's like Reshiram Charizard has had Outrage for a while. Reshiram Charizard GX is a good card. If we're just going to carry on with that tradition, then would Regirock not be a good card? Regirock V specifically. I keep on going back and forth on it, and it's just like, I don't think it's bad at all because it has, 220 HP. So if you're hitting into it, it might not get one shot. You might be able to one shot back. And similar to Claydol, you do get the whole suite of the fighting type, damage modifying cards, where it's like you got the Martial Art Dojo, you got the Diancie to beef up that damage. So I think it's just a pretty cool card attack. Like, it's a cool card in general. I don't really like it for its second attack, but I think its second attack does have some merit. It's more of like, fighting's not in right now. I think it has potential, but I'm not necessarily sold on this card. It's more like neutral for me.
I'll cover what I like about this card. I do like that it has 220 HP. So this is actually one of the sturdier, like normal Pokemon V we've seen in this set. So that's definitely good. And like you said, it does have access to all of the different fighting support, but I just have no idea what deck you actually want to play this in. I'm not building around Raging Hammer. And while the second attack is decent, I think there's just more efficient ways to two-shot things in the format. If we had like a Focus Sash reprint in Standard, I think Regirock would actually be pretty cool. But since we don't really have anything like that, I actually think this card's pretty bad. I actually like Claydol more than Regirock V. I know you're probably not the biggest fan of that statement, but I think that's where I'm at right now. But
Yeah,
again,
definitely not a fan of that statement at all. Like, I'm literally like, the friendship is diminishing here. Like, packing the bags on the whole rare candy whole thing. But in all seriousness, you're entitled to your opinion, I guess. I'll put it as nicely as that.
There you go. So, like I said, if we get something akin to a Focus Sash reprint, I'll be much more excited about Regirock. But for now, I just don't. If we're doing 190 for 3, I'm going to do 190 for 3 on a Pokemon that can at least accelerate energy to itself. Or if I want to use Outrage, I'm just going to use Reshizard. So I think Regirock's really bad for the moment. But again, 220 HP is good, and it does have access to a lot of fighting support. So if for nothing else, Zach, I guess you could keep your eye on it. But again, for the moment, I think it's pretty bad. Next up, guys, we have Graplocked. Graplocked is going to be a Stage 1 Pokemon, 130 HP, Psychic Weakness, and 2 Retreat. And it has 2 different attacks we're going to look at first. I definitely think the first is probably the more notable of the 2, though. And it has Octolock. The attacks of your opponent's active Pokemon require 2 more energy, and it can't retreat. This effect lasts until this Pokemon is no longer your active, and you can't apply it more than one of these effects at a time. So you can't like stack this attack over and over and make your opponent need like 8 more energy to attack or something crazy like that. Then its second attack for 2 fighting and a colorless does 130, and it's not affected by resistance. So as I mentioned, I definitely think this first attack is the much more interesting of the 2. And I actually have to say, I'm really bummed about this card because I think this attack is really cool. It's very similar to the like signature move that Graplock got in the recent Sword and Shield video games. So I thought it was really cool they tried to like emulate that in a way for the TCG. But I just think there's a lot of ways to like kind of break out of this effect. So if your opponent just plays a Switch or a Mallow and Lana, they get out of this. As simple as that is. Or if they play a custom catcher or a Pokemon catcher to bring up something different, it's going to nullify this effect. Or if you're playing against a welder based deck, they're like, okay, I'll just welder 2 more energy and keep attacking. So I just think there's a lot of ways to break out of this. And that's what really bums me out. Because I do think there's actually a good bit of cards that synergize nicely with this. But I just think there's too many ways to break free of this like soft lock that this card is kind of going for here.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that, what you said, is exactly where I'm at with the card. I think we both looked at this card and we're like, yo, this is an effect that seems pretty cool. And it is really cool until you realize that your opponent has many ways to either get you out of the active position or their Pokemon out of the active position. Now, one way that I thought of, or that we collectively thought of to get rid of some of your opponent's options would be Omastar. If we had a very light bench, our opponent couldn't play Switch, they couldn't play a Skateboard. However, like your opponent could still just drop a Fiona against you and gust your active Pokemon away. Ninetales can gust your active Pokemon away. And expanded, there's Guzma. I don't know what else to say for this card. Like I originally thought that it was going to be fringe playable, and then reading more and more into it, it's just not great. You'd probably have to try to remove all your opponent's energies, but you eventually run out of ways. There's just no winning with this card right now. Maybe in the future the format slows down a little bit more and there's more ways to like reliably cycle through what you have going on to reduce your opponent's options to get around grab locked. It could be okay, but I don't have high hopes for that right now. I just think this card's bad as much as I really, really like it.
So I'm going to add on a little bit there. Even though I think I'm in agreement with you, I think ultimately I am going to give Graplock the thumbs down as much as it hurts me to do so. I think there are a lot of cards that synergize with it. I don't think you should undersell how strong Amistar can be because it basically reduces their switching options to just Mallow and Lana. They're probably going to play one Mallow Lana, maybe 2, with, some copy of Cynthia or Caitlyn. So maybe let's just say under item lock, they're probably going to have 3 switching outs in the course of a game. I think that drastically limits their effects. And with our only catcher effects right now being item based outside of Ninetales, again, that's going to reduce the amount of outs to getting around this. And even in terms of Ninetales, you can even play something like Stealthy Hood on your bench targets to prevent Ninetales from bringing them up. You point out Crushing Hammer that we have. We're getting a new Team Yell supporter card, which will remove your opponent's energy as well. And if you're playing this, it doesn't have an ability, so you can play greens, or if you want, you can play Bill's Analysis if you want to go like the Amistar route. So I think there is a good bit of cards that pairs well with this thing, but I still would ultimately agree that it just requires a lot of setup. Like not only are you setting up your Pokemon, but you also have to set up all these counter strategies to what your opponent is trying to do at the same time. And I just am not confident that you're going to be able to do that. But really cool attack. Just a shame that right now is not a good time for it though. Up next, we have another Pokemon VMAX evolution line that's going to be Stonjourner VMAX and Stonjourner V. So before we get to the VMAX, let's look at its base form. With Stonjourner V, it's a basic with 220 HP, much like the Regirock we already looked at. Grass Weakness, 3 retreat cost, has 2 different attacks, the first of which is going to be Guard Press for a fighting energy, does 40, and during your opponent's next turn, this Pokemon takes 20 less damage from attacks. And its second attack for 3 fighting, just a vanilla 150. And then Stonjourner VMAX is a VMAX with 330 HP. Same thing, Grass Weakness, 3 retreat, and 2 different attacks. Same attack costs. The first attack, you attach 1 fighting energy from hand to one of your Pokemon, then heal 120 from that Pokemon. And its second attack is just going to do a vanilla 200. So I actually have to say, I think I really like this card, specifically because of the first attack on Stonjourner VMAX. Like, fighting really isn't a great type in terms of accelerating energies. And so not only do you have a way to cheat energies into play, but you also have ways to just kind of tank hits until you're ready to go on the offense with this card. And 200, in addition to all of the fighting damage modifiers that we've kind of talked about already with some of these other cards, does kind of scale the damage output high enough to be able to do some substantial amount of damage. We can 2-shot any of the VMAXs that aren't fighting weak. And depending on the modifiers we're using, we actually can theoretically one-shot tag teams, especially if you do get in some chip damage with the base form Stonjourner in the early portions of the game. So Zach, I remember you like this card. I'll pass this over to you. How do you feel about some of the cards to combo with Stonjourner here?
Well, I think that Stonjourner, it's one of those cards that it's kind of like a cross between like a Gardevoir Sylveon GX meets Primal Groudon. It's a pretty tanky Pokemon. It can heal. It has energy acceleration. It has decent attacks. And it has, like you said, it has all the damage modifiers available to it in fighting form. So I just think it sounds good in general. Like it just doesn't sound bad. It's one of those cards that I'm kind of lost in terms of how do I want to build this as a deck? How do I want to test this in general? But it's one of those things that I just feel in my gut it's going to legitimately be good. I'm going to dabble around with the card, do some testing with it. Maybe we'll do some testing with it on the channel and start figuring out exactly what's the best way to play this deck. And I think that's the only way that we're going to find out what the partner is, if there is a partner for this card. Because I think it could go either way, where you go with a really offensive approach, where you're like, okay, I'm going to have to hold Diancie, Martial Arts Dojo, maybe Shrine, all those damage modifier cards. Or it could go defensive, where you're like, I'm just going to be a big blocky Pokemon.
No pun
And
intended.
yeah, exactly. I guess. Stop. Anyways, it could heal. It could do some other stuff. So I think it's going to be one of those two. Maybe it could even be one of those like mid-range decks where you have a little bit of healing, you have a little bit of offense. I don't know. Stonjourner VMAX and Stonjourner V both seem like they're pretty cool cards. I give it playable at the very least. At the very worst, it's like could be playable.
Yeah, I actually think these are some of the better Pokemon V we've looked at in the set review thus far. I kind of echo the same sentiments. Unlike something like Lapras, where you're just like, oh, you just play it with Frosmoth, you play it with XYZ, and the deck's just going to like build itself, basically. Whereas something like this, I'm just like, well, do we play it with Jirachis or something like that? Or like the Baby Zygarde? Or do we just play like a Greens engine? Really not sure. I think we just have to kind of get in some games with this thing and just see what sticks and what doesn't. But I think there's enough support to where, like you said, you can build this a more aggressive route, or if you want to go more defensively, and maybe even play it closer to like Primal Groudon, where you play something like Pokédolls just to kind of set up behind until you're ready to start swinging with your Stonjourner. Not really sure, but I like the card, and I'm excited to see what happens with it. Alright guys, next up we have an entire evolution line we're going to be looking at, and that is going to be the Galarian Obstagoon line. So specifically, we're going to be taking a look at the Zigzagoon and Obstagoon. Linoon, really not too important, but I think both the basic form and stage 2 are actually really cool cards. So starting off with Zigzagoon, it's Dark type with 70 HP, Grass weak when retreat, and it has this ability once during your turn before you attack, whenever you play this card from your hand onto your bench, you may put one damage counter on one of your opponent's Pokemon. So that's really the interesting aspect of the card. And then the Galarian Obstagoon, it's essentially the same ability, but instead of one damage counter, it's 3 whenever you evolve into it, whenever you play the card from your hand. And it does have an attack worth pointing out as well. For a dark and colorless, does 90, and during your opponent's next turn, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by your opponent's basic Pokemon. So as I said, I think both cards are actually really cool for different reasons. The Zigzagoon has been drawing a lot of comparisons to the old Crobat G for good reason. It's the same ability. Granted, Crobat G, I think, was a little bit stronger just due to all of the different SP support that existed at the time. But nevertheless, the one damage counter, as simple as it seems, is actually really impactful. That is so frequently the difference between getting a knockout and not getting a knockout. You know, we've seen decks like Greenzard play things like Shrine of Punishment previously to be able to one-shot Pikaroms just because of the one damage counter. They're willing to go as far as to play cards that hurt themselves just for one damage counters. That's how impactful the single counter can be. Obstagoon also good, of course, for 3 damage counters, but the attack is really interesting as well. Being able to shut out basic Pokemon is really good. You know, granted, VMAX Pokemon can still knock you out, but as long as the tag teams are still seeing play, this can shut out a good bit of the tag teams, and a lot of the tag teams that have outs to hitting you actually can't one-shot you. So what I mean by that is the Greninja GX is a common inclusion in the Mewtwo Mew decks, but it can only hit you for 130. Also, there's the Keldeo GX that exists right now, but it only hits for 110 or 140 if they are playing an ADP. And again, not knocking you out in one hit. And so as a result, I think the Obstagoon's attack is actually pretty solid as well.
I think what a lot of what Eric said is very true there. Galarian Zigzagoon is probably my favorite out of the two cards that we're looking at because unfortunately Galarian Lanoon does not live up to its pre-evolution or its evolution. It's kind of it coexists. Night Slash for 20 and switching with a bench is not really going to cut it in this case. However, when we're looking at something like Tantrum Head, placing a damage counter, I could see this being played in many different decks. You could play it in anything. It's splashable. Galarian Obstagoon on its own is pretty cool as well. I know Eric was discussing about Eviltal GX, but that requires 4 damage counters. So you could use Galarian Obstagoon with a Galarian Zigzagoon to put 4 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon, and then knock out that Pokemon with an Eviltal GX. Especially in a format where we have a bunch of Tag Team GX and VMAX Pokemon, getting an instant knockout for 4 damage counters could be huge. Another good combination with it would be the Sableye V, about putting the damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon, and then punishing them for having damage counters on them with Wicked Claws. Beyond that, I'm not 100% sold on the Obstagoon, but the Galarian Zigzagoon I think is an instant pickup, and I'm going to be picking up at least 2 copies of that card when I buy my Sword and Shield cards. Galarian Obstagoon, if the store has them at a decent price, yeah, I'll pick it up, but that's kind of where I'm at with it.
I actually really like this evolution line. I'm excited to play around with both the Obstagoon and the Zigzagoon. They both have a lot of partners. And even looking at, I think one of the big downsides to Obstagoon having a 2 attack cost, I think there's other ways to even get around that. Like we have Weavile with red and blue, so you can like red and blue into Weavile GX, move the energy to your Obstagoon, get it powered up that way. And I think some people might look at the damage output and think 90, that's not a whole lot. And while it's true, you do have to remember we have all of the damage counters that we're placing with Obstagoons, with Zigzagoons. And if we play cards like Fishing Rod or Lana's Fishing Rod to recycle our evolution line, we actually get to keep placing these throughout the course of a game. Overall, I think this whole evolution line is super cool, and I'm a pretty big fan. Next up, guys, we have Sableye V. This is a card we briefly mentioned when talking about the Obstagoon evolution line, but this is a basic with 170 HP, has Grass Weakness and a 2 retreat cost. And its first attack for just a Dark Energy, it says put a trainer card from your discard pile into your hand. And then its second attack for 2 Dark Energy does 10 plus 60 more for each damage counter on your opponent's active Pokemon. Obviously, this pairs nicely with the Obstagoon line we just looked at. We can use Obstagoon and Zigzagoon to get a bunch of damage counters in play and then nuke our opponent with Wicked Claws here, as the 60 damage modifier for each damage counter is actually, I think, pretty good. First attack, also kind of okay, especially if you start with this thing. It's kind of like the old Sableye from Dark Explorers. A little bit better, a little bit weaker in different ways. It's better in the sense that it can be any trainer card and not just an item. But of course, it's weaker in the sense that you only get 1 card and not 2. And of course, giving up 2 prizes in addition to that. So I think if you're playing the Obstagoon deck, you're playing 1 to 2 of these Sableyes. I feel like the second attack's too good not to play in conjunction with those. And I think a lot of people have kind of been thinking about that. But Zach, are there any other applications that we see here that the Sableye V could also be good for?
I think it's one of those cards where your mind immediately has to like think about spreading potential. And for me, I'm looking at it and I'm like, Roxy Weezing seems like it could be pretty decent, where you just put 10 damage counters, or you put 10 damage on each one of your opponent's Pokemon. With you do Weezing Roxy twice, then you're doing 250 in general, and they have 4 damage counters on them. So you'd be knocking out most Pokemon in general, which I think is pretty strong. I like Sableye V with some kind of spread aspect. I know we don't have a Tapu Koko promo in our format where it could spread 20 to everyone. Something like that would be pretty cool, and maybe this deck would work and expanded with counter energy or something like that. Or I know Eric discussed it even with the other Weezing where it does 20 to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon, stuff like that. If you ask me when Sword and Shield releases, is there going to be a Sableye V deck? And I'm going to say probably not right now. In a couple months, will there be a Sableye V deck? Yeah, maybe there will be. Maybe it will be played with the Galarian Obstagoon, as we both pointed out. It could be very playable, but I'm going to be a little bit more cautious and say that I'm kind of in the middle of the road. It could be playable in the future.
Ultimately, I'm going to land a little bit more neutral on this. I think needing the second Dark Energy is actually kind of a pain. It's not the end of the world because we do have ways to get powered up with things like Bead, and if you want to go like the Weavile GX Red and Blue combo. So there's ways to get it up and running, but the 2 energy attack cost is a little bit annoying. And unlike something like Obstagoon, where you can wall behind Obstagoon's attack and, kind of take your time getting your manual attachments down, Sableye's going to be facing a little bit more pressure if it's in the active spot. And there's a good chance you're going to lose those energies on your opponent's next turn whenever you start attacking with this thing. But nevertheless, if you're playing the Obstagoon deck, I think you absolutely have to consider Sableye V as a potential 1 or 2 of in that deck. So I think it's a cool card, and I actually think this artwork is pretty sick too, just as like an aside. I think this is one of the best Sableye artworks that we've had. But yeah, I'm a fan, just not one of my favorites in the set. I think I'm going to remain a little bit cautiously optimistic in the middle on this one. Alrighty guys, next up we have Galarian Berserker. It's going to be a Stage 1 Metal Pokemon, 120 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistant, and a 2 retreat cost. And we're really just looking at for this ability here. It says the attacks of your Metal Pokemon do 20 more damage to your opponent's active. So we've seen this type of effect before from cards like Altaria back from Dragon's Exalted, and even currently in the format we have a very similar card from Dragon Majesty. We have the Lurantis promo that saw some play in like the Sceptile GX deck that your boy here help popularize a little bit. And of course, more notably, we have Diancie Prism Star, but of course Diancie's a basic, so it's not completely analogous to what we're talking about here. But nevertheless, these other Pokemon like Altaria and like Lurantis have seen play in other decks, and there are some pretty good Metal Pokemon coming out in this set that wouldn't mind some extra damage, most notably Zacian V. So Zacian's definitely going to be one of the big new Pokemon that looks to come out. Hits for 230, which is a pretty good amount of damage, but it is a little bit shy of taking one-shots on some of the different tag teams that exist in the format. If you play an Arceus Palkia GX with it, you can buff it up to 260, but you're still 20 short of knocking out opposing ADPs and 280 HP tag teams. So Galarian Berserker could actually kind of serve that role. Or maybe if you really want to get cute, you could even cut ADP entirely and just go for a pure metal energy based deck and play like a thicker line of Galarian Berserker with things like Fine Band and maybe even Shrine of Punishment if you want to go that route as well. So I definitely think there's a pretty decent practical application for this card. And any metal Pokemon going forward will have to look at this and see how the damage output would affect its math in terms of taking knockouts.
It's definitely one of those cards where it gets grouped in with the damage modifiers. Like Eric said, like Altaria and Lurantis, those cards have seen some light play at the very least. So I think this is definitely one of those cards that you probably want to hold on to in case metal type just becomes strong at any given point. And with some of the new cards coming out, like Zacian and Zamazenta both being metal type, it seems like those cards could see some success with the Galarian Berserker. Going into other things, there could be some cool ways to balance it with synergy of like a Lucario Melmetal GX. So your opponent's is doing minus 30 or to your Pokemon, and you're doing plus 20 to theirs. And I think it's one of those cards that can only potentially grow better with age. It's one of those cards, I don't hate it. I think it's probably neutral right now. Probably keep this one in the back of the binder, but still maybe pick up a couple copies at the bare minimum.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to go a step further. I'm actually going to commit to saying this card is good. I fully expect Zacian V to be one of the most impactful cards from this set. And as a result, I think depending on how lists start to shape up, you could see people prefer different types of tools for different sorts of matchups. So what I mean by that is if you are concerned with hitting tag team numbers, right now you have the current options of ADP, Berserker, Fine Band, and Shrine to kind of build your damage buffs with. But if you want to still play something like Metal Frying Pan to have an edge against the mirror, you have other ways, thanks to cards like Galarian Berserker and ADP, to get around having to play Fine Band as well, while still being able to play your own Metal Frying Pan. So I think this card is pretty solid, and I think you're going to have to keep an eye on it when any Metal Pokemon gets printed. So I am a fan of this card. Alrighty guys, next up we have Galarian Stunfisk. This is a basic Pokemon with 120 HP. Has this ability, Steel Trap. If this Pokemon takes damage from an attack of your opponent's active Pokemon, discard 1 energy to your opponent's active Pokemon. Then its attack for a metal and colorless does 30, and you flip a coin until you get tails and does 30 more for each heads. So cool ability, god awful attack. Most time if you're attacking with this thing, you're only hitting 30, and 30 for 2 is just generally really, really bad. But the ability, however, I think is actually pretty cool. I think if you're putting this in a deck, I think you're putting it in something like Beheeyem or the more Pico V deck or Hitmonchan, something like that, just because you can throw this active in between attacks and punish your opponent for attacking into you in the process. So that's about where my ideas kind of run their course, though. I know it's a pretty short list, but I think hit and run style decks could potentially like a card like this, especially since we're getting Air Balloon in the same set to reduce its retreat cost to 0. That will open up a door for 2 retreat Pokemon to actually now be viable wall targets for these hit and run decks.
Maybe it could be a cool idea to play with like Lucario Melmetal GX to reduce your opponent's damage onto it, and then comboing that with some kind of I don't know, like a metal core barrier, metal frying pan, or a metal goggle, some kind of like thing like that where you're reducing damage done to your Pokemon, your opponent's discarding an energy. The only issue with that is that you still need to take damage. So if your opponent's just like, okay, cool, but I guess if you're not taking damage at any given point, then your opponent's just chilling there doing nothing. So maybe an attack, like maybe some combination of cards like that could lead for some pesky little lock deck. I like your idea of using a hidden run attacker to discard some energies, and then, like you said, with the air balloon, you could pop back and jump back and forth in between that. So it doesn't seem bad. It doesn't seem great. I'm kind of neutral on this card. I feel like it could be playable. I'm probably going to have a couple copies in the back of my binder, but that's probably where they're going to stay, as the back of the binder.
I'm going to remain a little bit neutral as well. I think the main practical application for this currently will be in like hit and run style decks if you were going to play it. But it remains to be seen if that's going to be the optimal way to go. Maybe just playing Pokédolls would be better. Maybe there's some other wall Pokemon that would take priority over this. I'm really not sure, but I think that's where its home would be, at least in my mind, in the short term. So, like I said, kind of neutral. It has some potential, but it's not super great right now, though. Alrighty, so next up we have a Corviknight card we're going to be talking about. Corviknight is a Stage 2 Pokemon with 170 HP, has Lightning Weakness, Fighting Resistance, and 2 Retreat. It has 2 different attacks we're going to look at, the first of which is going to be Peck, just 1 energy for 50, and its second attack for a Metal and 2 Colorless. You may discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. If you do, this Pokemon takes 100 less damage from attacks during your opponent's next turn. That's a really, really good effect from this attack. 130 is fine. We have enough damage modifiers to make sure we can 2-shot tag teams, but 100 reduction on a 1-prizer with 170 HP is really, really solid. And the 2 energy discard really isn't even a big deal, I feel like, with a card like this, just because we have triple acceleration energy, which fulfills that part of the cost since it discards itself anyways. But then we also still have the new Metal Saucer card, which can get metal energies out of the discard pile and attach them to your Pokemon. Actually, streaming this attack really isn't even that hard. But even if you don't want to, you have the option of discarding. You don't even necessarily have to do it. But still, 100 reduction, I can't believe. And that's not even factoring in things like maybe Lucario Melmetal, Metal Frying Pan, Metal Core Barrier. And just in general, I think there's a lot of support for this card. There's a ton of cards that have synergy with this thing. Now, of course, it's a Stage 2, so that's one of the big issues going against it. But, Zach, I mean, it seems like there are a lot of cards that could potentially pair well with Corviknight here.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with you on that. I think you got to go with, it's kind of like Stonjourner in a way where it's like you're powering up your Pokemon with things that do extra damage, or you're going to be going with things that reduce your opponent's damage. So I could see this card working with Galarian Berserker to do some extra damage, or going in with a Fine Bands, or some kind of something so that you're 2-shotting most Pokemon with 130 damage attack. And before I dive into anything else, I do want to let it be known that Corvisquire, its middle form, it can do 20 and discards all Pokemon tools. So if there's any pesky Pokemon tools, that is a way to get around it. So like spell tags or even like a Shedinja. Anyways, for me, I think I like running this card as a defensive maneuver with triple acceleration energy, or maybe even like Welder and Metal Saucer. And for me, I'm not as hot on this card as Eric's kind of trying to sell me on it. I want to put this card bad. My player instinct is telling me to put this card as bad. but Eric sold me enough on it to make it more of it. It is possibly playable. I'm not going to put it as instantly playable. Maybe damage reduction is just something I'm not used to, or something that I'm not as experienced as Eric. So I'm going to put it as it might be playable. I'll leave you with any extra thoughts, Eric, if you got anything else.
Yeah, I'm actually going to fall into the same category. I think the reason I'm not committing to saying it's good is because I think this is 10 damage short of being a good card. And the reason I say that is because now, in order to two-shot tag teams, you have to run some sort of additional damage modifier. And being a stage 2 deck, you already are committing a lot of space, and a lot of your prime real estate in your deck is committed just to getting it set up. And needing to play something like Shrine or Fine Ban or Galarian Berserk or something like that to ensure a two-shot, I think might be the difference in terms of a consistent deck being built around this. Other than that, I have nothing but positive things to say about this. It just remains to be seen if all of these cards can fit, or at least most of them can fit into a cohesive 60 card deck. And that's going to be the real challenge for it. But I do like the card, and I think it definitely deserves to be tested with. Alrighty guys, next up we have a Stage 1 Metal Pokemon that is going to be Copperajah. So this is a Stage 1 with 190 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a 4 Retreat cost. It has two different attacks here, the first of which for 2 metal is 60, and we heal 30 from this Pokemon. And second attack for 3 metal does 220, and if this Pokemon has 8 or more damage counters on it, this attack does nothing. So I think at a glance, if you are unfamiliar with some of the cards coming out in this set, this looks absolutely terrible, but we do have to remember we do have the Metal Saucer card coming out in this set, so we do have ways to actually accelerate our metal energy into play. So 190 HP on a Stage 1, that's really good. 220 damage for 3 energy on a 1 prize Stage 1, also solid. 4 Retreat, also solid. That grants you access to things like buff padding, though I think there's probably better tool cards that you might want instead of that. There's Metal Frying Pan, Metal Core Barrier. We have Lucario Melmetal if you want to reduce your damage for the rest of the game. And basically, I think you're just trying to reduce damage that way to ensure you can always use Mighty Trunk. The issue is, how do you reduce your damage enough to always ensure that you are under 8 damage counters? Even though this card has a lot of support, I think Zacian V coming out in the same set, being a basic, having an insane ability, doing 10 more damage, and doesn't have a horrible downside to its attack, probably is just a bit better than Copperajah here. I don't know, Zach, do you see any way to build around this thing?
The way that you explained how to play this card is probably the way to play this card. We got a Magnezone, I think, that does metal energies from Ultra Prism, right? So we could power it up that way too. There's no shortage of supply of ways to power up a metal Pokemon, especially with Metal Saucer coming out in this set. The only issue that I have with it is 190 HP is awesome on a Stage 1, but it doesn't really change the fact that other decks are just going to smack 190, knockout instantly. The 8 damage counter threshold, if this Pokemon has 8 and it's doing nothing, that sounds kind of whack too, especially if your opponent's playing some kind of spread deck. This card's cool. I think it's just a casualty of the power creep of Pokemon in general, the amount of HP. 220 is not really killing it. I'm kind of against this card. It's by no means it's a bad card. It's probably okay at a pre-release or something like that. But that's probably where I'm going to keep it there. Just more of a for fun card than a competitive card. I think other cards in the set are just strictly better.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm going to commit to saying this card is bad. But again, with Zacian V coming out in the same set, it's a hard case to make to put 3 energies on a Copperajah instead of a Zacian V. So probably not the best metal Pokemon to use. Next up, guys, we have Zacian V. This is, I think, probably one of my most hyped cards of the set. This is going to be a basic Pokemon V, 220 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, 2 Retreat cost. Has an ability here, Intrepid Sword. Once during your turn, you may look at the top 3 cards of your deck and attach any number of Metal Energy cards you find there to this Pokemon. Put the other cards in your hand, but if you use this ability, your turn ends. And it's only attack for 3 Metal Energy. Brave Blade does 230, and during your next turn, this Pokemon can't attack. So I have to say, I think this card is pretty insane. Metal gets a huge boost from the set thanks to the Metal Saucer card that is coming out. So we have Metal Saucer now to get Metal Energies out of the discard onto our Pokemon. We have Lucario Melmetal if you want to go a more defensive route with this and just try to tank with Zacian Vs. You have ADP, and I think this actually might be the optimal way to play ADP, at least initially going forward. just because with ADP, you can buff Brave Blade up to 260, and with something like a Fine Ban and Zigzagoon or Shrine of Punishment, or even the new Galarian Berserker, you can actually one-shot any tag team outside of like Magikarp Wailord, and of course just trade 2-hit knockouts with VMAX Pokemon. So I think this is just an insane partner for either of those tag teams we just outlined. And this ability is super sweet. If nothing else, it's just a draw 3. Like even if you don't hit Metal Energy off of this ability, it's kind of like a soft tropical beach for your turn. And especially now with the inability to play supporters on turn 1, you can just end your turn by a draw 3 and hope to get an extra attachment in the process. So I think this card is so sweet.
It's just in general a good attacker. I could see a bunch of different ways. I like the idea of what Eric was saying about Arceus Dialga Palkia. I like that you might even be able to run this card on its own, like just swinging quickly. This could be a perfect combination to go, again, either one of two ways. You could go offensive or defensive. I could see this working in a Lucario Melmetal deck after you use your GX attack. So this Pokemon's taking 30 less damage, and then you could put like a Metal Frying Pan on it, so it's 60 less damage. And you have a big attacker on top of that. So a big attacker, you could knock out Pokemon. I think that Galarian Berserker could also be pretty cool here, where you could be doing an extra 40 damage if you have 2 in play to be hitting for 270. And again, this card will work with Shrine of Punishment, Fine Band, Roxy Weezing, a bunch of other damage modifiers that we have already. So I think this card is very cool, and it lives up to its legendary status in the Pokemon TCG. Yeah, no, I think it's super playable.
One thing we haven't pointed out is it is weak to fire. So it's something I think we are obligated to point out just because of how dominant fire decks have been ever since Welder has come out. But in a way, it's really not even a huge deal because we have Metal Frying Pan, and even against something like Blacephalon, even if you don't play Frying Pan, you guys just trade knockouts. Like, even though they knock you out, you can also just power up a Zacian V in one turn and have a return KO. So even in some instances, the weakness doesn't even matter as much as it may have in previous formats. But again, with Metal Frying Pan in the mix as well, you can easily take care of that. But you will have to be wary of fire Pokemon just because Welder is still such a good card in the Pokemon TCG. So definitely something to be on the lookout for. But overall, I think this card is just really sweet. We have the new Professor's Research card to get Metal Energies in the discard. We still have things like Acrobike. We have the new Quick Ball as well. So there's just a ton of support for this card, and I think this is going to be one of the most widely played and dominant new cards that is going to come out from this set. So yeah, I'm a huge fan. Alrighty guys, next up we have the other counterpart to Zacian V. That's going to be Zamazenta V. So this is a basic Pokemon V. This one has 230 HP, so just slightly tankier than its Zacian counterpart. But fire weakness, grass resistance, 2 retreat, has an ability here. Prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon VMAX. And then its only attack here for 2 metal and a colorless is 130, and you discard a special energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. So I think at a glance, I mean, this definitely is not the big powerhouse that Zacian is, which makes sense. This is the more, defensive out of the two. And I think the ability here is probably the most interesting aspect of it. Assault Tackle is fine, especially against one prize decks. I think that is one area where this does maybe perform a little bit better than Zacian V. Like, think about like Malamar as an example. This is a much more efficient way at attacking into Giratinas as opposed to attacking with Zacian. But again, the ability is really the main thing I think that catches people's eyes here. Being able to wall against Pokemon like Snorlax VMAX, Lapras VMAX, etc. is something I think that will become increasingly more important as we naturally get more VMAXs added to the card pool. But what I do like about this is that Zacian, its blind spot is that even though it can one-shot tag teams, it doesn't really have that option against VMAX Pokemon. So if you are playing Zamazenta, like probably just as a one-of in whatever Zacian deck you have, if they do start to power up like a Lapras VMAX, you can pivot into this and force them to commit energy to something that your Zacian can actually attack into in one shot. So I think that's where Zamazenta looks to be pretty good. That, and again, against weaker like one prize decks like Malamar as an example.
For me, my stance against this card is we're comparing it to its legendary counterpart. They're both metal, gigantic, 2 prize card Pokemon. The ability is not as strong as attaching extra energies and drawing cards. At least it doesn't end your turn. it's not as strong as something like a Keldeo GX. It's not like Pokemon V and VMAX. At least I could get behind that. Because the issue here that I have with this card is if your opponent has a Pokemon V out, they can still attack with that Pokemon V, just not the VMAX counterpart. And I know, Eric, you said that, think about like all the V Pokemon. There's Stonjourner, there's Lapras, and there's a bunch of other ones, but in this set, they're just not strong enough to knock you out. My issue with this card is that it doesn't necessarily future proof itself well, because I think Pokemon V are only going to get stronger and stronger over time, to the point where I think a Pokemon V is going to be able to just smoke a Zamazenta out of the water. Assault Tackle, again, is kind of a meh attack, 130 for Metal Metal colorless, and discarding a Special Energy. I don't think Special Energy is going to be too popular beyond like maybe Recycle, Rainbow, and the new Aurora Energy looks very promising as well. But discarding an energy doesn't really live up to the hype for me. So like, I'm not sold on this one. Maybe it's because I played through Pokemon Sword on the Nintendo Switch, and I'm just like one of those like naysayers. I just maybe just don't like this Pokemon, but it has potential.
I definitely disagree. I definitely think this card is good. It's not the powerhouse that Zacian is. You're not building around this like you would Zacian. But again, just as a one of, if VMAX decks look to be popular after Sword and Shield releases, again, this forces them to pivot into something that can't one-shot you, that you can return KO with a one-shot. And I think that makes it definitely worth considering. But again, if VMAXs don't become popular after Sword and Shield, this card might not be as worthy of a spot in your Zacian decks. So I still will actually commit to saying the card is good, especially because only more VMAX Pokemon are going to be printed. But it remains to be seen what are going to be the dominant decks in format. And I think that will shape whether or not you devote your one spot in deck to the Zamazenta or a different card that takes priority against the other base form Pokemon V or existing tag teams. But I still do like the card though. Alright guys, next up we have the very last of the new Pokemon VMAX that we're going to be getting in the Sword and Shield set. And this is going to be Snorlax V and of course Snorlax VMAX as well. So first going over Snorlax V, this is a basic Pokemon, 220 HP, fighting weakness for retreat cost. It has 2 attacks, the first of which for 3 colorless energy, does 60, and you heal from this Pokemon the same amount of damage you did to your opponent's active. And then its second attack for 4 colorless energy, 170, and this Pokemon is asleep. And then Snorlax VMAX, which is probably a little bit more interesting out of the 2 Pokemon we have here, has an insane 340 HP, making this the biggest Pokemon now in the Pokemon TCG, even eclipsing Magikarp Wailord GX. But just like Snorlax V, this has fighting weakness and a 4 retreat cost. And this one just has 1 singular attack though. G-Max Fall for 3 color synergy is 60, plus 30 more damage for each of your benched Pokemon. So I definitely think out of the 2 of these, Snorlax VMAX is certainly the one that is a little bit more exciting. But I will point out some things about both of these Pokemon we have to keep in mind. They both have a 4 retreat cost, so that means they both can abuse something like Pokemaniac if they want to get set up that route, or if they want to use buff padding to get some more HP. Especially with Snorlax VMAX, I think that could be a potential option just to get upwards of 390 maximum HP. That seems pretty insane, especially when you already are such a bulky, tanky Pokemon like this. But this attack is pretty cool. You know, if we just run through the math, 60 plus 30 more with a full bench, we're going to be capped out at 210, which is fine. We can two-shot everything in the format. With some damage modifiers, we can even one-shot some of the other opposing Pokemon V out there with a Fine Band or maybe like a Galarian Zigzagoon. But what's really cool about this card, I think, is the fact that it has a 3 energy colorless attack cost. So that gives us a number of different options to power this thing up with. Of course, we have triple acceleration energy to get this guy up and running with just 1 singular attachment. We have the Welder engine. We have Malamar. We even have, I think one of the more interesting options is Porygon Z, since there are a number of different special energy you could use to power this thing up, like Recycle Energy or even Memory Energy if you want to copy either of the previous attacks on Snorlax V. So we have a lot of different routes to go here. But Zach, like, what do you think, which of these, if any, sounds appealing for Snorlax V?
For me, I think the best way to run it is probably Porygon, because you want to heal tanky Pokemon, and that's usually been a theme with any Pokemon that hits when 200 was a big number, you wanted to heal it. Now we're power creeping all the way up to 340, and I think it's probably better to try to heal this Pokemon. With Hyper Potion discarding 2 energies off of a Pokemon, it's a little bit of a drawback. but you heal 120. Because of Porygon and Recycle Energy, you can heal, get those energies back, and reattach them in the same turn. You don't necessarily need the Porygon out right away. It's something that could happen a few turns after your setup because triple acceleration energy can carry you until then. So I think a combination of those two. Part of me wants to see like if this Pokemon could work with like a welder engine. I've been playing with Ability Zard and Fire Toolbox for a while now, in the Cosmic Eclipse format. And I like how you have Ninetales. I like how you have Victini Prism Star. I like Fire Crystal, Fiery Flame. Like all those cards are very good and very strong. And I think those carry the concept. So Snorlax VMAX might be really nice because those Pokemon automatically need a pretty large bench already. So my bench is usually filled. Things like Dedenne. Like the thing that I like about Snorlax, you could feel happy about having a Dedenne on your bench. And with a full bench in standard, 210, and then this card potentially expanded with a Skyfield, can be hitting for 300 damage. It's crazy. So I think Snorlax VMAX has a bunch of potential. It's just its potential seems almost endless right now to the point where it's confusing where to start. So I think this card's pretty awesome. I think I really like this card.
It seems we're both in agreement on Snorlax VMAX, and we have definitely a lot of ways to go when playing this thing. So I think we just have to do some experimenting and just get some hands-on time with the card to see what the best route for it is. But at the end of the day, I think we both agree this is definitely a pretty strong card. Definitely has potential in both the standard and expanded format. So if this is going to be the last VMAX that we're going to look at in the set, I think we chose a pretty good note to end things on. So Snorlax VMAX, definitely, I think, a very, very solid card. Alrighty guys, so next up we have a new Stage 1 Pokemon we're going to be looking at. That's going to be Cinccino. This is a Stage 1 Fighting Weak, and the ability has actually will look really familiar to anyone who's been playing for a couple years. It says once during your turn before you attack, you may discard a card from your hand. If you do, draw 2 cards. Then it does have an attack as well for a colorless energy just 40, and you attach a basic energy card from your discard pile to one of your bench Pokemon. So this attack is fine, but obviously the ability is really what's caught a lot of people's attention here. This is the exact same ability that we've seen on Inteleon from Dark Explorers, and probably more notably Zoroark GX. And so I feel like we're going to have a similar conversation as to what we had about Silvally GX in the last set review, where it got revealed. A lot of people are really hyping it up to be the next Zoroark, especially since Silvally in particular had kind of a similar style attack as well. But I had to kind of say, you know what, this is not going to be the next Zoroark despite the parallels that exist between it. And I feel the same way about Cinccino. A lot of people are looking at this thinking Zoroark's back, but no, that is not the case. There's a multitude of reasons Zoroark was good, and its attack was one reason for that. You could pretty much two-shot anything in the format while having an insane consistency boosting ability. Cinccino is pretty much only good for its ability. Its attack is fine. It's not bad by any means. But you really can't build around this the way you could build around Zoroark. Zach, do you think that's a fair thing to say? Do you think the community's been, a little bit too hyped for this ability?
Zoroark GX is one of the most dominant cards of all time, and we're like, oh, cool. Let's print it on a Pokemon that has 120 less HP, a Pokemon that doesn't have an attack, and be like, Zoroark's back, everybody. It's all fine. And I don't know if it's just like millennial depression or whatever else we're going to attribute that to, but that's wrong. I think everyone can agree that Cinccino is an amazing card. Absolutely busted card. Will it see play? 100% it will. But we have to understand that I'd say 70% of Zoroark decks were probably attacking decks. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I would say so.
And the other half were control decks. Here, we lost 70% of function if we're just going off that pure metric alone, where it's like, you're not swinging with a choice band and a full bench and all these other tech cards that you have with energy assist. You're doing 40 damage, homie. That's not going to cut it. So the way that we got to look at this card is not that we're attacking with this card at all. I think, well, we could use energy assist. Don't get me wrong. I think energy assist is not a bad attack. It's just not as good as Zoroark's attack. But we got to be looking at thrifty, not trade, thrifty, because it's a different name now.
You know people are still going to call it trade, though.
Oh, people are definitely going to call it trade. They're probably going to have the Zoroark coins that they're going to place on their Pokemon for every time they use an ability that they've used when they've had Zoroark as well. So pulling those out of the closet. But Cinccino is going to be drawing cards. it's going to make your decks a little bit consistent. So any deck that I think we've seen Pidgeotto in, people can at least start there and experiment with it. So Eric and I were discussing, we have Baby Blacephalon. For me, I was like, I don't know if I want to use Pidgeotto no more. Like Pidgeotto's cute with the whole Professor Elms engine, but I think that Chinchino drawing two cards instead of drawing one cards is a big difference. And then decks like Ability Zard, where we saw Robin Schulz win the Latin American International Championships with a Zubstrika in his deck to get around control decks. We might see a Chinchino there because discarding your hand and drawing four might be a little bit too rough for a certain deck. So I think the possibilities are endless. For me, I'm more excited about the control aspects of what this card can have, where we've seen how Zoroark Control, a non-attacking Zoroark deck, or a barely attacking Zoroark deck, uses cards such as Oranguru to get resources back that were discarded, and continuously uses control-based cards, so like a Bellabun, Bryson Man, or Lieutenant Surge, or getting back Palpad, stuff like that. So in the Pidgeotto Oranguru deck that we currently have in our standard format, I think Chinchino might be a solid upgrade for a deck like that. It might change a little bit, but in general, I feel like it's just a very strong card in that aspect. And then everything else is going to kind of get sprinkled in here or there, where it's Chinchino is going to draw cards for a specific deck. I'll let Eric jump into a bit. I don't want to steal all the thunder from this card. I'll pass it back to you, Eric.
I think I agree with you about it being primarily, I think, initially looked at as a potential way to substitute for Pidgeotto. I think Elm in general gets a little bit worse with the new first turn rules coming up as well. So I think that's another reason to maybe consider more of just a quick ball sort of engine to get your basics into play going forward. And if that's the case, I think Cinchino is generally going to be better than Pidgeotto, especially since it does have a half decent attack as well. In terms of an attacking deck, I'm not exactly sure where I want to see this in. I find it a little bit hard to imagine this going into like any of the tag team decks. While you certainly can do it, I don't think it's really particularly going to shine there. To me, this reminds me of something closer to Octillery that we saw in previous formats, where Octillery has Silvali's ability, you draw until you have 5, but even though we have a decent amount of strong support Pokemon that are bench sitters, a lot of them really don't work that well in a lot of the more one prize evolution based decks that kind of exist. So Silvally isn't really ideal, has a 2 retreat cost, and also it gives up 2 prizes. Zebstrika, if you're an evolution deck, isn't really that optimal just because you tend to have a lot of moving pieces, and the discard from it is very unforgiving sometimes. Pidgeotto, the draw is somewhat weak unless you are already running like an Elm engine. So Cinchino to me actually seems like probably the best like bench sitting support Pokemon. Much like in the way that Octillery used to be for the current format. So think of a deck like Cinderace. I think this could be a viable like 0-1 line or 1-1 line, just because Cinderace in particular, you want energy and discard, and stage 2 decks, they need help always setting up the next Pokemon. Cinchino, much like with stage 2 decks a couple years ago, would play Octillery, like the old Gardevoir GX deck, just as an example. So I think that's kind of where the role, I think Cinchino has a lot of promise, that and probably control decks. But overall, I mean, I think its ability is super good. Trade was really good. Like we've kind of mentioned, the Zoroark saw play even in decks that really didn't attack very often. So yeah, I definitely like this ability. I think it remains to be seen what like the ideal home for it is, but this ability is too good not to see play. It's on a 1 prize stage 1. It's pretty easy to get in play. And you have like a half decent little attack you can use, unlike something like Octillery of the past or Pidgeotto or Zebstrika, just as an example. So I'm a big fan. Unfortunately, guys, I don't really have a really definitive answer of the best home for this, but nevertheless, I fully expect this. It sounds like Zach's kind of on the same page in terms of we definitely expect this card to see some degree of play. Just remains to be seen what is that ideal home, though. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a new Oranguru card. Oranguru is a basic Pokemon, 120 HP, 2 retreat, fighting weakness, and it has an ability and attack. The attack, really not too good, so we're just going to focus in on this ability. So it says, once during your turn before you attack, you may switch a card from your hand with the top card of your deck. So this is a really interesting effect, and this is actually one of the few cards at the time of filming this segment. I've actually had some chance to test with this a bit. I actually have to say, this ability is super, super cool. It's kind of like the old Oranguru in a way, like the old Instruct one. A lot of times with Instruct, you're only going to draw like one maybe 2 cards, unless your hand got reset to a low size or something like that. And most of the time, this is going to work basically just as well as the old Instruct one. But I think there's actually a lot of instances where manipulating a card in your hand with your top deck can be pretty useful. I think one of the big ones is actually with Zacian V. So Zacian V, of course, has that really strong ability where you look at the top 3 cards of your deck and attach any metal energy you find there. So Oranguru actually combos with that very well to set that up. But there's also other random things where this ability is just super good. If you're playing an Acrobike as an example, and you're playing a deck that wants stuff in the discard, maybe it's Malamar, maybe it's even another metal deck, and you can put a metal energy or a psychic energy in the case of Malamar on top of your deck to discard with the Acrobike, and then use something like Malamar or the new Metal Saucer to put that card back in play. Or let's say you're going to Dedenne your hand away, but you have like a crucial resource that you don't really want to get rid of. Well, no big deal. Put it on top of your deck, and then that way you can draw right back into it and you don't have to discard it. So I think there's actually a lot of really interesting uses for this thing. And like I said, out of the games I've been able to test with this card has actually been a lot of fun to use.
For me, I think it's cool with cards like Macargo. Macargo was played in, let's say, Buzzwole, Garbodor, Shrine, a deck that won the Oaks Regional Championships about a year ago. That deck used Macargo to put cards on top of the deck, and then it used Oranguru from Sun and Moon to draw up to 3. So you have to have a low hand size. The best thing about this card, you don't have to have a low hand size. So you could use Macargo to put a card on top of your deck, and then replace a card from your hand with the top card of your deck and grab that card instantly. I like combinations like that, such as like Chandelure to get an extra Pokemon on top of your deck. But realistically, I'm with Eric where I feel no matter where this card sees play, the best one's probably going to be with the Zacian to get an extra energy there. I think it's good. Its options are endless. And with most Pokemon cards being legal for approximately 2 years in our standard formats, I'm very excited to see where the potential lies for this card.
Even outside of like a really specific combo, I think this ability just gets value out of really any deck. Imagine you play a Cynthia. Suddenly, if you play a Oranguru, all of your Cynthias are effectively a draw 7. So what you can do is, if you have a Oranguru in play, you Cynthia, let's say you didn't hit the piece you need, you replace your supporter for next turn, since you can't play another one, you put that on top of your deck, and get to see an additional card. So it basically just makes all of your supporters dig 1 card deeper. And like I said, if you just replace a supporter with your top deck, it basically is just effectively a draw 1. Even outside of specific highly combo oriented situations, I think there's just a lot of good general value to get out of Oranguru. So, Zach, I don't know where you fall on this thing, but I have to say I'm a pretty big fan of this card. It's one of my more favorite Pokemon in the set, actually.
I'm going to agree with you on that one. I'm really excited for the future of this card. I think this card is very strong. It's a card that you definitely want to have on you at most times because it could fit in almost any deck. So I really enjoy this card. I'm excited to start testing with it.
Alrighty guys, next up we have the very last Pokemon of the set review, and that is going to be Cramorant V. This is another Pokemon V. This one has 200 HP, lightning weakness, fighting resistance, 1 retreat. Has 2 different attacks, the first of which for just a colorless energy, you search your deck for 2 cards and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. And then its second attack for 3 colorless energy, you discard all energy from this Pokemon, and it does 160 to 1 of your opponent's Pokemon. So while I think both these attacks are actually pretty good, the second one I think is really where people's attention is going to lie, because 160 happens to be just enough to knock out Dedenne GX, which sees no signs of slowing down in terms of play even after Sword and Shield comes out. So giving yourself an out to just sniping a Dedenne seems really attractive, especially when you have such a flexible attack cost. You can throw this really in any deck that has energy acceleration, whether it's like a Welder variant, or maybe Malamar, or even like the weird Porygon Z Snorlax VMAX sort of deck that we talked about earlier when talking about Snorlax. I think Cramorant can pretty easily find its home in anything. And even the first attack, while I think that's definitely not the reason you would play this card, this is actually a really strong attack, just being able to search your deck for 2 cards of any type. That's really solid if this is like your Pokemon you end up leading the game with. Especially, again, going back to like the Porygon Z style deck we briefly mentioned earlier. You could grab like a Porygon and a rare candy ready to go for next turn, or whatever you might need for whatever deck that you're playing. But of course, the second attack Spit Shot is really why you would want to play this. And just being able to snipe a Dedenne, pretty good. You can't really go wrong with that. So while this card isn't like game breaking or going to be a deck of its own or anything like that, this attack is just too good, I think, not to see play. What do you think, Zach?
No, I think we're definitely on the same page when it comes to it, where it's like, look at Cramorant, and it's like, okay, even if you run it as a one of tech card, if you start with it, you got Beak Catch. You got to look at so many other like one of tech cards. So right now, Malamar is pretty popular. Lists are running Trevenant Dusknoir. If you start with Trevenant Dusknoir, you're like, my life is over. This sucks so much. But Cramorant V is like, yo, I'm actually gonna search for like two cards. Don't worry, I got you. And then Spitshot, like Eric was saying, we got Dedenne GXs on the bench. Sometimes you could even snipe another important Pokemon. I'm sure with Dex, as we went over in the section, we had the Chinchinos. If you could snipe away your opponent's Chinchino, maybe you'll be able to ruin their setup or something like that. Or maybe they'll have I know Florges, even though Florges plays Mew and Sky Pillar, that might be a way to get around a deck like that. I've thought about running away with this card with Ability Zard, and then Eric was bringing up that there's Ninetales in the deck that can bring up whichever Pokemon I want anyways, and then if I can attach 3 energies to a Cramorant, why would I want to play Cramorant in like a Fire Toolbox deck? And the answer is like Stealthy Hood. This is a direct connection to the bench. As long as there's no Mew or Sky Pillar in the format, it's something to consider at the very least. So I think this card will see play. I really like this card. I'm going to try to fit it into a few decks.
For sure, this is definitely just going to be like a one of. Even though we have all these hulking Pokemon VMAX in the set and other superstars like Zacian V, it's easy to overlook a card like Cramorant, but I actually do think this is a potentially solid one of like backup attacker. And so yeah, I am definitely a fan of this card though. Alrighty guys, so next up we have a new trainer card we're going to be talking about. That is going to be Air Balloon. Air Balloon is a Pokemon tool card, and it says the retreat cost of the Pokemon this card is attached to is 2 colorless less. So you can see Pokemon's really been dancing around giving us a direct Floatstone reprint. You know, we got a skateboard, we got U-turn board, of course we still have Switch, now we have Air Balloon in the format, in the mix as well. And I have to say, much like with some of these other switching tools we've had, I am also a fan of Air Balloon. You know, even though you don't get the opportunity to retreat something like a Jirachi, getting to reduce the retreat cost by 1 more is actually pretty substantial. I think a really good example to kind of highlight this is a lot of the hit and run decks that have kind of existed, or a lot of the hit and run cards that have existed over the past couple years. You know, ever since we lost Floatstone, a lot of the best wall Pokemon you could promote actually are kind of clunky to move out of the active spot. So Keldeo GX is one of the better, more recent examples of this. Hoopa from Shining Legends was also a card very similar that also had the same issue. Both these have a 2 retreat cost, and something like U-turn board or a skateboard really wouldn't cut it. So your Hitmonchan deck, your Beheeyem deck, whatever it might be, really hasn't had a great way at moving these Pokemon. If you did want to go for a hit and run style deck, Air Balloon's going to enable that. Also, it's just good across the board, even in stuff like Malamar if you wanted to play it, though I think most decks are still content with just using Jirachi as their pivot. They could play Air Balloon, give their Malamars free retreat. This now actually enables Dawnwing's Necrozma potentially as a new pivot Pokemon with the Invasion ability. You can slap down Air Balloon, and now, much like with the old Keldeo EX, you have a pivot that always can come into the active spot and then freely retreat into whatever you want. So I think this card is really cool, even though it's not Floatstone. I'm excited for this.
You brought up the Keldeo GX. I actually played in a League Cup where my opponent had to attach an escape board to a Keldeo GX to try to get out of the active position, and then had to discard an energy off of it in order to retreat, and had to do that 2 times. So needless to say, they were struggling a little bit with the retreat cost, but I was like, what would change if we just had Air Balloon in the format then? And it was just like getting a couple extra energies in the game. Factors like that are often game-changing enough. Cards like Silvally GX might see a little bit more play with free retreat in general. So I think a lot of it comes down to if your Pokemon's got 1 to 2 retreat in general, definitely look into it. It's not a Floatstone, but it's the best kind of effect we've had in here, besides a skateboard working particularly well with Jirachi. So I'm about this card. I like having this card in my deck building little box, and I think I'm just going to look forward to seeing what options are available in the future.
Even though I don't think every deck will play it, some decks will still prefer something like a skateboard if they're playing Jirachis, but nevertheless, it definitely now gives certain types of decks a reliable switching tool that they previously didn't have access to. So Air Balloon, definitely a welcome addition to our retreating options. Next up, guys, we have a new supporter card. That is going to be Bead. It says, attach a basic energy card from your hand to one of your bench Pokemon. So this is a new kind of form of energy acceleration. I don't think you're building your whole deck around this effect, but being able to get an extra energy play is definitely good. We've seen other cards like Aqua Patch, Dark Patch, and even the new Metal Saucer see play for similar effects. Now, granted, a couple of things to point out here. Bead is a supporter, not an item, but on the flip side, it does allow you to accelerate for any type, which is pretty cool. So I think for this card to be good, we have to look at like the different types that already don't have reliable forms of energy acceleration. I think some of the types that stand out, I think fighting is going to be one of the bigger ones, non-Pikarom lightning decks, non-Guardian fairy decks maybe, and non-Dark Box dark decks potentially. I think specifically too for decks that only need 2 attachments to get attacking. So if, let's say for example you have an attacker that only needs 2 attachments to attack, you really don't want to commit the space to a card like the Lightning Magnezone just to accelerate one single additional energy. That's just a ton of deck space for such a little payoff. So I think for decks like that, Bead actually could be kind of decent, and there are a couple of practical applications I could see for this card. Like we've seen ADP in the past play Ends Resolve to get that second energy in play on turn 1 to use Altered Creation GX as soon as possible. I think Bead is definitely at the very least a better version of that style of ADP. I think another deck we could point out that we talked about earlier in the set review is actually the Obstagoon, Galarian Obstagoon deck. You really don't need to run like a red and blue engine and Weavile and stuff like that just to get one extra attachment into play, I think. So I think a card like Bead could be handy for that as well. So I think these are some of the ways I'm thinking about this card. But Zach, this is a support at the end of the day. Do you think that is ultimately going to matter in terms of the playability of this card?
No, I think you pretty much hit everything. I think the biggest use that I could see is probably with some kind of like ADP deck. I know when I was building the deck on the cusp of the new format, Connor Finton and I, we experimented with every single possible way that we could build the deck. We actually ended up settling for that event on Rayquaza GX, and I guess, boy oh boy, were we ever wrong. Turns out that sometimes no energy acceleration was better than the options. Nowadays, I think we would have probably settled on Bead. I think Bead is likely better than having no acceleration in general. So that's an improvement for a deck that we already have that's at one of the top decks in our current metagame. So I could only imagine the other little niche spots. The only issue that this card is going to deal with, as Eric said, is a lot of types already have their built-in kind of support when it comes to energy acceleration. So whether it's going to be Frosmoth being the new card for water type decks, or if we're going to be having welder decks for anything that can run colorless energies or fire decks in general. Bead is that in-betweener card, and it's nice to have an in-betweener card.
It just kind of fills in the gaps for the other types that just need, just a little extra boost of energy acceleration. Some of the types, they have energy acceleration, but it's kind of awkward. Or like I mentioned with the Magnezone example, it just requires a ton of deck space for such a little needed amount of energy in certain situations. So it's just nice that we have kind of a generic form of energy acceleration like this to give decks options, if nothing else. So I actually have to say I'm a fan of this card. It's not, I think, one of the best trainers that we're going to be looking at, but I think this is good enough to see play, and I think it's definitely worth picking up a couple copies to have. Alrighty guys, next up we actually have an old favorite coming back into the format. That's going to be Energy Retrieval. Energy Retrieval is a card we've had for so many different formats, and it finally is coming back into the game. So it's an item. It says put 2 basic energy cards from discard into your hand. So for newer players, very similar to Fire Crystal, you do get 1 less card. However, the trade-off is it works for any energy type, which is definitely pretty good. So I think right now, one of the decks that will probably be looking to run this in some counts is going to be the new Frosmoth archetype. Fire, of course, already has Fire Crystal to use for that, but Frosmoth in particular, it's going to be good for just because you can get these energies out of the discard, then immediately throw them down with Frosmoth, and that's kind of where we've seen cards like this mainly see success in the past. Zach, I don't know if you know of any other specific decks that are really going to be looking for this, but I mean, it's kind of just always been one of those cards we've had in the format. It's always seen play in some sort of capacity. It's just kind of been a staple over the years.
Yep, no, and I totally agree with you. Now, in a format where we have Fire Crystal, we got to be careful on what we think of when it comes to this because I was like, oh, maybe I'll play this like in a welder deck. That doesn't sound too bad, right? And it's just like where my mind goes, and I'm like, oh, never mind. I have Fire Crystal. That seems a little bit better. If there's a more specific version like Fire Crystal that's better, sure, play the Fire Crystal. That's the end of the line there. If there's nothing that gets your energies back, then you could totally play it with, you could just try adding it into your deck. And I think that's where more of the experimentation is going to come with this card. I think it's a necessary card that we have, that we need in our format, the same way that Switch has been a staple since the beginning of time, etc., etc. But yeah, I'm excited to have this card back into our format. It's been a little bit too long without it.
Yep, not too much else to really say about Energy Retrieval. Just a nice staple. Finally good to see it come back into the game. Next up, guys, we're going to be going over the first of a couple of different new search cards that we're getting that are definitely needed in this format, and that is going to be Evolution Incense. So it says, search your deck for an evolution Pokemon, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So this is actually kind of a reprint of a couple of different cards. In recent memory, we had Evo Soda, which was very similar, though a little different. Evo Soda did require you to evolve into the Pokemon, which makes it a bit worse than this because you can't really grab stage 2s if you have like a basic Pokemon in play. So this is definitely better than Evo Soda in that regard. But also this is the same as the old supporter Professor Elm's training method. Same effect. Professor Elm's training did see play in many formats ago. So the fact that we have that same effect as an item is definitely really, really nice. So, of course, we can grab Stage 1 Pokemon, we can grab Stage 2s. As we understand it right now, we can actually grab Pokemon VMAX as well. So that's definitely going to be a big use for this card. And, you know, we've been a little bit starved of good searching options for non-GX decks specifically lately. So this is definitely, I think, a really welcome card, especially if you're not a deck that can abuse something like Treasure, you know, Netball, or any of these like highly specific typings that some of our current searching options provide us.
I think Evolution Incense, it's one of those cards that, like you said, it's something that we've been craving for in our format. We've been deprived of item-based search, so non-supporter-based search, for a while now, and it's exciting to have at least an option back. I know there's a couple other cool cards in this set that are going to help us out to do so. So, Evolution Incense, play on a deck that plays Evolution Pokemon. Whether that ends up being a Mewtwo Mew deck to pitch evolution Pokemon into your discard pile, or it's going to be a full-on real evolution deck that's not controlled by some big basic Pokemon. Especially with Pokemon VMAX coming out, those being evolution cards, and with other stage 1 and 2 options in the set, I think there's a lot of options built into Sword and Shield, and that's just this set alone. I think we might see a few other cards pop back into the metagame, or maybe this will be give us enough of a searchability for stage 2 cards that we see some evolution decks make it back into our format instead of mostly basic decks. I don't think there's really too much to touch on this card. It's just one of those cards where it's good, it's going to be played. So I like this card. I'm probably going to mess around with it in some of my evolution decks.
Next up, guys, we have another Pokemon tool card. This is going to be Find Band. Find Band says, the attacks of the Pokemon this card is attached to do 10 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon, of course, before applying weakness and resistance. And I think the name of this card tells you all you need to know about it. It's just kind of fine. It's not amazing. But, you know, it gets the job done. 10 damage. It doesn't sound like much, but 10 damage is actually really impactful in a lot of situations. So if we think back to last season with how some of the different Reshizard lists were being built, we saw them playing things like Shrine of Punishment. That way they could knock out Pikoroms, or back when Choice Band was still around, they could use Choice Band plus Shrine of Punishment to actually knock out opposing Reshizards in the mirror match. Don't underestimate how impactful 10 damage can be. It makes all the difference between getting a KO in certain situations. And as long as that's the case, Find Band is going to be a card that sees play. So it really doesn't matter how much the modifier is, as long as it makes the difference between getting a 1-shot and a 2-shot, or the difference between getting a 2-shot and a 3-shot, whatever it might be. So even though at a glance this card looks really weak and underwhelming, I actually think I'm going to stand by this card and say it's good, just because 10 damage is relevant in a lot of practical situations.
To hop in there, it's one of those things where if I think about all the games that I've lost by like 10 damage here and there, there's more games than I have fingers, and I got a full hand of 5 on both, so we're not dealing with that. It's crazy how you think 10 damage can change the world, or it could change the world of Pokemon. It can. You could have a Reshazard 230 to knock out a Pikarom. Cool. That's awesome. For me, the biggest thing that I see with the card, I'm kind of looking at it and being like 10's a little low, especially like where the power creep's going, where it's like, if we looked back 5 years ago, we would have never thought we were going to see a 340 HP Snorlax VMAX Pokemon. And I'm like, where is the band that's doing an extra 50 damage? So I think that's kind of where I'm at, where it's like the damage modifiers aren't really at the same power creep level. Like, if anything, this is a worse muscle band. It came out some time ago. Looking at it, it's the 10 damage feels a little underwhelming. That's not to say that I won't play it. For me, I'm a little bit neutral on this card just because I'm not feeling the plus 10. I think this card can see play. I think it actually probably will see play. I'm just not the biggest fan of just the plus 10. I want to see a little bit more beef in my burger.
Honestly, what I would have preferred to have seen from this type of tool card is more like a choice band pseudo reprint, but against Pokemon V and GX. So we've seen, for example, the Boltund in this set references it does more damage against GXs and Pokemon V. I would have liked to have seen something like that, even if it was plus 20 or even plus 30, like choice band, just so we had some V and VMAX hate. I think that would have been cool, and hopefully that type of card still comes. I would like to see something like that, maybe even closer to the old Silver Bangle, only for non-GX, non-Pokemon V cards. I think something like that would really help a lot as well. But I think for the moment, this is a fine addition to the card pool. And even though 10 just feels weak, it feels wrong almost to kind of like say this is a good card. As long as 10 damage is relevant, it's a good card. So that's why I'm still going to stand by it. But Zach, I totally get why you might feel a little bit more neutral on a card like this. But I think we both agree this probably will see play in some capacity no matter what. Next up, guys, we have another new item card that is going to be Fishing Rod. This one says shuffle up to 2 Pokemon and up to 2 basic energy cards from your discard pile into your deck. So something to point out, back in our first impressions video that I did on the channel a little while ago, I initially thought this card was kind of mediocre, but then some people came out and clarified the translation is up to 2 Pokemon and up to 2 basic energies. I thought this was literally just 2 cards, but it's actually you can get up to 4. And the fact that it says up to on the card also really significant, just because that gives you some flexibility in terms of what you want to put back in your deck. You don't always want to put back every target that's in your discard pile. But I'm really excited about this one, Zach, just because our recovery options are really terrible right now. We don't have Super Rod in the format, which has historically been probably the best general recovery card we've had. Also, we lost Rescue Stretcher, which has been another phenomenal recovery card that we had during the Sun and Moon era. And right now our options are Brock's Grit, Lure Ball, and Lana's Fishing Rod. Not the most stellar lineup of recovery cards. So the fact that we're getting this is just, it's fantastic. I'm a huge fan of the Fishing Rod card.
As am I. I think it's like the issue is that we've had with this format. They've taken away our search cards, such as Nest Ball, Ultra Ball, all those cards that we were really used to. Then they took away our use of Super Rod and our use of Rescue Stretcher. So it's left us with Brock's Grit. And then when Lana's came out, we were pretty happy about Lana's being in the format again. But now we got like a full, actual, real Super Rod. And this one is souped up. And so as Eric said, I like the up 2 on the 2 Pokemon and the up 2 on 2 basic energy cards. It does make this a little bit more of a skill-based card where you have some options there. It allows you to choose exactly how you'd want to play it. So maybe you have this in a Mewtwo Mew deck. You're trying to use Solgaleo GX's Turbo Strike to power up a Turtonator that you're getting back in the same turn. This card allows you to do so. So a lot of decks right now that are kind of weird or unplayable because you need to have a lot of Pokemon, I think it'd be cool just to have this card back in the deck. Stage 2 Pokemon or kind of single prize card attacking decks, they need to have a little bit more attackers to deal with these big GX Pokemon. A card like this fits naturally into those kinds of decks.
Yeah, you mentioned single prize decks. I think it's one of the types of decks that benefit the most from this set. As you mentioned, we don't have Nest Ball, we don't have Ultra Ball, we don't have good recovery options. So a lot of these decks that aren't Malamar don't really have a great way at succeeding in the current format. So I'm really happy for what Sword and Shield is doing for these types of decks. And I know if Carl was here on this set review with us, he would be talking about Vikavolt with me because we were both fans of the Vikavolt deck, and it lost Stretcher, which was so bad for the deck. But now you can play like 4 Lure Ball and 4 Fishing Rod if you want to get back your Charge Bugs. So shout out to Carl. I know somewhere he's happy reading this card. But yeah, I'm right there with you, Zach. I'm really excited for this card. Definitely one of my favorite items or trainer cards in general that we're getting from this set, actually. Next up, guys, we have another Pokemon tool card. That's going to be Giant Charm. Giant Charm says, the Pokemon this card is attached to gets plus 30 HP. So we already talked about with Fine Band how big of a difference just 10 damage can be. So if 10 damage can be relevant, 30 more HP can also be just as relevant in certain situations. However, I'm not quite as initially sold on Giant Charm. I think this is a card that will be more dependent on like what numbers the current meta is hitting, and if, for example, if you're a deck that gets like one-shotted barely by like the best deck in format or something like that, you can run like 1 to 2 Giant Charm to like kind of tech for those matchups. But I don't know how needed this card will be until we actually get like a better idea of what are the numbers that we're going to be going up against in the Sword and Shield format. So like I'm a little bit more reserved with a card like this as opposed to Fine Band, just because a lot of cases you'll still get one-shotted, or sometimes plus 30 HP won't make a difference between getting 2-shotted and 3-shotted. So it's like a card that's like good in a vacuum, but I think until we have like a more clear metagame, I don't want to like take a hard stance on this card just yet.
And you want to know what? I'm in the same position. It's one of those things where it's just like it's almost not a card that we could talk about because the format's so up in the air, especially in anywhere else that's not Japan. Giant Charm is one of those cards where it's got to be like bodybuilding dumbbells in the same sense where getting an extra boost of HP is not bad by any means, but it only matters in a format where they can't take it off. And I think the only current way to take it off is like either like Farfetch'd or like the odd Faba, which will see play, but not to the direct way that it's going to matter too much. It's one of those things where I'm just not entirely sure if I like this card right now. Not to say that I won't play it in the future. So I'm kind of like in the middle. I think it's gonna see some play, but I don't know how much play it's gonna see. I don't know if you have any final thoughts on it, Eric, at all, but I'm kind of like this card's meh to me.
Yeah, I'm kind of right there. I'm kind of in the middle on this card. Really not a bad effect, but you know, as we said, 10 damage can be relevant. Also, 30 damage can, like you said, with bodybuilding dumbbells. Sometimes the HP difference does matter in terms of the popular numbers that are being hit in the metagame, but it's hard for me to really get excited about this card until we know what are the numbers that we need to try to avoid here. So for the moment, I'm a little bit neutral on it, but I also would not be surprised if it saw play as we get a better idea of the types of numbers that our decks need to be hitting. Next up, guys, we're getting another reprint coming back into the format. That's going to be Great Ball. Great Ball says, look at the top 7 cards of your deck. You may reveal a Pokemon you find there, put it into your hand, shuffle the other cards back in your deck. So funny enough, we've had Great Ball actually for quite some time. And it really only, I think, started to see widespread amount of play back towards the end of its lifespan, starting kind of around when Lost Thunder came out. Basically, in a lot of Zoroark decks, we saw decks like Lost March play this. And basically decks just with a ton of Pokemon start to include Great Ball into their mix of different searching options. So it's a card that historically, honestly, hasn't been that great. I think the last time prior to that where Great Ball saw play is back when it was called Master Ball many, many years ago and had the same effect. I'm not too excited about Great Ball coming back. It's fine. It's good that we have it in the mix. But I don't think it's going to see the type of widespread play that we'll probably see with cards like Evolution Incense or more notably Quick Ball.
I could see something like getting out Snorlax VMAX, getting those Pokemon out on the bench very quickly and playing a lot of Pokemon. If you look at other decks too, we just had the San Diego Regional Championships and we saw Preston Ellis, Jacob Chen running some weird Persian box deck that played 31 Pokemon in it. So it's not necessarily about having a specific Pokemon, more or less having a Pokemon. So having a non-supporter search back into our format seems pretty cool in that regards. Beyond that, I think Great Ball's always been kind of a meh kind of card. It has popped up at some points, but it is something that's nice to have as an option in a format, especially as we've been starved from kind of item or ball based search.
I think it probably just might be a little bit overshadowed by some of the other searching options, but it's definitely great to have it as an option. That's really just what we've been lacking for non-GX decks. It's just the options to get Pokemon. If nothing else, you have Great Ball in your toolbox to pick from. So I'm actually going to stay, I think, a little bit neutral on Great Ball just because I don't know if I can think of anything I really love Great Ball in initially. But we did see it pop up a little bit towards the end of its lifespan last time. So, I mean, there is precedent for it to happen again. But for the moment, I think it's neutral. It's just kind of fine to have it back, though. Next up, guys, we have another new item card that is going to be Hyper Potion. It says discard 2 energy from one of your Pokemon. If you do, heal 120 from that Pokemon. So this is actually kind of like the old Super Potion that we had, but literally just twice as good. Super Potion had you heal 60 and forced you to discard 1 energy. This is literally just twice as good and built just into one single card, which is kind of cool. And even though Super Potion wasn't a particularly popular card, it actually did see some play in Primal Groudon decks just for the discarding and healing ability that it had. So the fact we have a juiced up version of that means, you know, there is some precedent for Hyper Potion to see some play here. And there's definitely a lot of Pokemon that would like to, I think, tank. We've seen a lot of these new VMAX Pokemon like Snorlax, like Lapras, that have energy acceleration. So you can heal off some damage and accelerate their energy back with something like Welder or with the new Frosmoth, whatever it might be. So I think there's definitely some Pokemon that might like something like this. However, I'm kind of struggling to see like the really broken application for this initially. I think there's plenty of decks that could play this, but I'm not sure what decks are actually committing the space to playing several of these. That's just kind of where like my head is initially at with this card.
I just want to make sure that I know exactly what this card does before I make a final stance on it. Because there's a world where if you don't need to discard 2 energies off your Pokemon, this card is significantly better. But if you always have to discard 2 energies off your Pokemon, then you have to like think about the decks that you could actually play it in. I know earlier on in the set review we talked about how Snorlax VMAX could be cool with Porygon. Like keeps on attaching all the energies. I think that'd be a really cool way to accelerate and then heal. For me, I think Malolana doing 120 and not discarding any energies, for me, that's kind of where I'm at, and that's making this card a little bit lower on my priority list. However, this is an item card and not a supporter card, so if I ever find a need to heal 120 and play a supporter in the same turn, this is definitely a card that I'm looking for. Or if it gets translated to the way that you don't need to discard 2 if you don't have 2 energies in general. So for me, I'm kind of in the middle on this one. I think it will see some play, at least, but maybe it won't.
So just for a little bit more context too, when Zach's talking about not needing 2 energy, that might sound weird given how the card reads. But if you think to something like Max Potion, where you discard all the energies on your Pokemon and then healed all the damage, you didn't actually have to have energy on the Pokemon to be able to use the card. And there's a lot of cards like that where you basically just have to fulfill the requirement of the card as much as you can, but you're still allowed to get the effect. So take a card like Super Rod of the past, or even the new Fishing Rod. If you only have one target in the discard pile, or even like Energy Retrieval, if you only have one target in the discard, you can still use the card. You just play it up to the amount that you can most fulfill. So that's kind of what he's talking about when he's saying if you don't have to discard 2 energy. So that is something we will have to kind of wait to get clarification on. As of right now, I think we're working under the assumption that's not the case and you do need 2 energy, just based on the current wordings of the translations that we have. But that's something that might change in terms of our rating once we do get the official English translation. But for the moment, I'm right there with you, Zach. I'm kind of neutral on this card. We have Mallow and Lana, which is already a great healing option, especially if you're already a deck that plays Tag Call and you're a tag team deck. You can easily search out the Mallow and Lana whenever you need it. You can get it back with Cynthia and Caitlyn. So I think generally speaking, I would agree that's probably going to be the main healing method we're still going to see even after this set comes out. But nevertheless, I mean, you could even double down on that strategy if you really wanted to. If you want to take your tag team deck or whatever that you have, and instead of going very aggressive, maybe you take like a Mewtwo Mew deck, just as an example, and instead of concentrating on being overly aggressive, you just build it around tanking hits, doing stable damage, and going that route. So I think there is a world where you could play this in addition to Mallow and Lana. But I'm right there with you. I think for the moment I'm a little bit neutral on this, especially without clear clarification on how this card is going to work. Next up, guys, we have ourselves another Pokemon tool card, and that is going to be Lucky Egg. It says, if the Pokemon this card is attached to is knocked out by damage from your opponent's attack, draw until you have 7 cards in hand. So it's actually a reprint of an older card called Lucky Egg back in Platinum or Arceus. It's definitely from that era of the game, though. However, as I understand it, I'm not sure if Lucky Egg saw a lot of breakout play back when it was initially legal. So we will have to kind of keep that in mind. But for this format, I think a passive sort of effect like this really isn't too bad on a Pokemon tool. If this was like a stadium, this would be substantially worse. But since we don't have something like Field Blower and Lysander Labs at the time of filming is not too popular, I think a lot of the time you're going to get the effect that you want out of Lucky Egg. I think really one of the only things that can really get rid of this is going to be Faba. And there's a couple of random Pokemon as well, but in terms of cards that see any meaningful amount of play, I think Fab is really the only one currently. I have to say, I think I actually really like this card since we don't have something like a choice band that's the go-to tool card in every single deck. I think a lot of decks actually have some flexibility in terms of what tools they want to have down on their Pokemon. And I think especially in a format now without something like the Instructor Oranguru, Lucky Egg is actually a really great way at hedging against reset stamps. So if you're playing a deck like the new Frosmoth deck, just as an example, that is going to be very susceptible to reset stamps since you're always attaching energy from hand, you can play Lucky Egg as your tool of choice. And that way, when whenever a Lapras VMAX gets knocked out and your opponent stamps you, you still get to refill your hand and have a much better odds of actually mounting a response to your opponent's plays. Also, greens decks, I think that's another thing for me that I'm looking at, just because on the turn it looks like you're about to take like a 3-prize knockout. You can slap down your Lucky Egg on like your Gardevoir Sylveon, just as an example, or Reshizard, whatever it might be. And then if your opponent does stamp you and knocks you out, you do still have a way at refilling your hand size. So I think this is going to be, I think, primarily just indexed to hedge against reset stamp. That's one of the big things. Zach, are there any particular decks that are coming to mind to you that you think really would like to abuse something like this?
A deck like Blacephalon GX, especially where you need a combo piece immediately after a knockout, I think Lucky Egg seems like it's going to be a great fit in a deck like that. Baby Blacephalon, you need to have the welder, the fires, extra fires, like anything that requires multiple combo pieces. Lucky Egg kind of fixes that. So for the most part, I'd say welder decks in general are pretty weak and susceptible to reset stamp. Those sound really good. Lucky Egg can fit in a whole bunch, and there's not a lot of ways to take it off. I think Faba, first and foremost, is probably the main way, and the only way that I could see reasonably taking care of a Lucky Egg. Other than that, I don't really see it as much. So I think Lucky Egg is definitely higher up on the playability list for me. I don't know enough for it to be like stable, but kind of a higher neutral for me. Like it's so close to being a must-have, but I'm going to keep it a little bit more reserved until I see what the format shapes up like. So not that it's like any specific way to play it into a deck. I just think that it will see some play, especially in decks that are getting hit hard with a reset stamp.
I think I might remain a little bit more neutral on this card, though. Like kind of you are, I'm very optimistic for it, though. It just remains to be seen what a 60 card list for some of these decks is going to wind up being after Sword and Shield comes out. So we'll have to see if we can find space for Lucky Egg in these decks. But it looks like it would have a pretty positive effect on them. And I'll throw out there another kind of meme idea if anyone's a fan of the Go Lurk that came out not too long ago that allows you to 160 for 2, but you can't have supporters in your discard. This is another way to make that meme like a rogue archetype work. So I'll throw that out there for all you 1-prize fans. But yeah, I'm right there. I like this card, though I don't know if people are actually going to commit to playing this in their list, or if this is going to be the best way to hedge against reset stamp. We'll have to see, but I like this card. I'm going to remain a little bit more neutral on it, but again, I'm leaning closer to saying this is a good card, though. Next up, guys, we have another Pokemon tool card. That is going to be Lumberry. Lumberry says, at the end of any turn, if the Pokemon this card is attached to is affected by a special condition, remove all of them and discard this card. So, as we mentioned kind of earlier in the set review with Galarian and Rapidash, special conditions just really aren't too prevalent. And Lumberry is just so situational. Full Heal has really never seen much play. I think the only special condition healing card that has really seen competitive play that I can think of in my memory is going to be probably Audino. And Audino saw play in like Flareon decks very early on, but that's really like the only thing I can really think of that has ever made its way into a competitive deck in recent memory. So I have to say, I'm not a big fan of this. If this was an ability on something like Rapidash, it'd be a little bit better. I think I'd rather play Rapidash than Lumberry overall, even though Rapidash is a stage 1. It's just a persistent ability. It's going to apply to any of your Pokemon. You know, realistically, you're not running more than 1, maybe 2 Lumberry, and they're going to be a little bit tricky to find since they are just going to be like a 1 or 2 of in your deck. So, I just can't find myself wanting to play this card. Like, I think, Zach, you were telling me when we were discussing this, like, rather just play Switch. That'll also get rid of a special condition.
Switch sounds pretty fire in comparison to this card. I'd rather play a Switch. I'd rather play in a Skateboard being another Pokemon tool card. So it's one of those things where Lumberry is, it's not very great because its special conditions are not popular. And there's a bunch of other ways to just naturally heal special conditions where it's like, just switch, just have a Skateboard. A Skateboard covers a lot of the bigger special conditions anyways. Like Eric said, in competitive play, special condition healing doesn't really see too much. So I'm going to chill on the Lumberry. I don't even think I'm like neutral or can see play on this card. I think it's going to be very much kind of bulk fodder, it's going to be its main purpose here. So it's way at the back of the binder, might not even make the binder, might not make the shoebox, might get left on the game store table kind of card. So
You literally took the exact word I was going to say out of my mouth. I was literally just going to say this is a complete bulk card that will probably never see play. So we've been looking at a lot of really good trainers, and this is by far, I think, the worst we've seen so far in this set. Next up, guys, we have a new supporter card that is going to be Marnie. Marnie says, both players shuffle their hands without looking and put them at the bottom of their decks. Then you draw 5 cards and your opponent draws 4 cards. So this is a very unique supporter that we have here. You know, most of the time when it comes to draw supporters, they are shuffle draw, like with Cynthia or like Judge, which is probably the card that will draw the most comparison with Marnie. But for this, it's important to read this carefully because you shuffle your hands and put them at the bottom of your deck. So you're not actually shuffling them into your deck. You're just basically putting your hands at the bottom and drawing from the top, which is pretty cool. And it's kind of like a better version of Judge going forward. So I feel like if you're playing Judge in any list, you would just play Marnie unless you are playing Judge Whistle in addition to it. I think that's really the only incentive to play Judge over this. But I think this is actually a pretty cool card that we have here. Especially in terms of disruption. Draw 5 is definitely a bit more reliable in terms of setting your own hand up, whereas putting your opponent at a 4-card hand is still, I think, disruptive enough. You know, I don't think there's like any one broken deck that Marnie is going to slot into here. So I expect it to see play in kind of just a variety of different decks. And a lot of my early lists that play Cynthia, currently at the time of filming at least, I've been substituting my 4th Cynthia for a copy of Marnie, just because instead of playing maybe a second stamp or maybe even playing stamp at all, you can just play some copies of Marnie to fill some of your draw supporter slots, opening up a little bit of space in your deck. So those are some of my deck building ideas around how to include Marnie in your list. And like I said, if you're already a deck that plays Judge, maybe you just switch to Marnie, like we saw the Pika Judge deck pop up at Worlds this past year where they play heavy copies of Judge. But, you know, you could still do something like that, but play Marnie instead, giving yourself a little bit stronger of a draw option while still disrupting your opponent every turn. So that's kind of like where my head is at, Zach. Are there any specific uses that you can really see for Marnie?
So I was thinking about specific uses, and it kind of brought me into a few scenarios where it's just like, let's say your opponent has 0 cards in hands, and you force them to draw 4 cards in a deck out. 4 cards would be more than what a Bellaba would deck them out at 3 cards. So it might be an interesting way to deck them out. Then I thought of it, and I was like, well, maybe Reset Stamp would be an interesting way to do that as well, but Reset Stamp is only better if your opponent is at 6 or 5 or 4 prize cards because it's an item card. So I think it could see some niche uses in some control decks to deck things out. Beyond that, I think it's just it's a generalized shield against what your opponent's been planning. So if your opponent's been building up a pretty solid hands or has a pretty big hand, it's a good way to disrupt it and directly put those cards at the bottom of your opponent's deck. I'm not sure how I feel about it as a typical like draw supporter. Like it might just fall under the same thing as a slightly better Judge or a slightly different Judge. Because I'm still not entirely sure if this card's better than Judge because you don't have an opportunity to draw. Like let's say if you had a key combo piece in your hand, this card, at least Judge gives you a chance to draw that back. This card might not allow you to do so. So it's one of those things where I like how it can dig and just directly dig the next 5 cards of your deck, and your opponent's getting a pretty slim hand. But beyond that, I'm kind of I'm confused by this card generally. So I'm gonna put it more in the middle than anything else. I just don't know what I'd want to do with this card yet.
So there's definitely pros and cons to this card, like you mentioned when you compare this to Judge. But in terms of the disruption, I actually think this is a much more disruptive card than Judge's. So think of a couple different situations in particular. A lot of the greens decks lately have been playing Amistar as a way to deal with certain matchups out there. So if you see your opponent greens for an unidentified fossil and another greens, you know for sure they have the access to the Amistar on the next turn. If you play Marnie, you're putting those cards back on the bottom of their deck and they can't actually draw back into them. Similarly, if they play something like a Lusamine to get back a couple of supporters for the next turn, guess what? You can put those at the bottom of their deck and they can't draw back into them. Unless, of course, they do something like search their deck and then play a Pokegear or something like that to, reshuffle the order of their deck. So I actually really like the disruption from this a lot more as opposed to what you get from Judge, especially if you know your opponent has in hand what they need to close out the game. I like Marnie. I'm actually going to say this card is good. I think you could see this pop up in a number of different situations. I'm kind of with you in terms of I don't know exactly where I'm playing. I don't know the exact context, but I like this card enough to stand by it for sure. Next up, guys, we have, I think, one of the most anticipated cards from the set. That's going to be the new Metal Saucer. It says attach a Metal Energy card from your discard pile to one of your benched Metal Pokemon. So this is the next in line of the different patch cards we've seen. Of course, most recently we had Aqua Patch back in Guardians Rising, and a little bit more notably, we had Dark Patch all the way back in Dark Explorers, one of the most format-defining cards until it finally rotated. And now we have the same effect, but of course for Metal Pokemon, which is, too good to possibly ignore here. And it just so happens in the same set, we're getting a good chunk of Metal Pokemon to potentially use this with. Of course, the big ones in the set are going to be the Zacian V and Zamazenta V. There's still a couple of other things in the format. Of course, Lucario Melmetal GX. I think those are going to be some of the big potential targets for this. We also mentioned Corviknight in this same set review as well. But in terms of, I think, the most hyped partners for this, I think the Lucario Melmetal and Zacian V are going to be the main ones to really focus in on. But really, this just makes any other Metal Pokemon worth exploring in some capacity. Whenever Metal Pokemon get printed, you just can't ignore the fact that we have this sort of energy acceleration. And with Quick Ball being printed in the format, and with things like Acrobike and the new Professor's Research, we have ways at putting energy in the discard pile. I don't really think that's going to be an issue.
I think it's fair to say that every single patch card has seen high playability at any given time, like whenever it was in the format. So I don't think I'm worried about this card being unplayable or anything like that. It's one of those things where this card's playable, it just depends at what point. So when we're looking at the cards that we can directly power up, the first ones that are going to come to mind are like Zacian, Zamazenta, Lucario Melmetal, maybe even like Melmetal GX or something like that. It's one of those things where which is the best one to power up?
Zacian V looks to be very, very impactful in the game, so I think Metal Saucer equally has to be, very impactful on the game. Aqua Patch wasn't quite as big of a card as Dark Patch previously was, but we still saw decks play Aqua Patch to success, and with Metal Saucer having a super good partner in the same set, I definitely expect us to see just as much, if not more play, than Aqua Patch at the least, for sure. So I have to say, I'm a big fan of Metal Saucer. I think this is definitely one of the better item cards that we've looked at so far.
And I agree with you. I think it's definitely one of the better item cards. It's going to get better as the format grows. Usually every set we have has Metal Pokemon, so I don't think that's going to end anytime soon. Let's just see exactly how the future goes with Metal-type Pokemon. Metal Saucer is going to be as good as Dark Patch and Aqua Patch were, and it's going to be only as good as the Pokemon that we're attaching the energies to. So I'm super excited for this card. Definitely one of the best cards in the set.
Next up, we have a new supporter, guys, and that's going to be Pokekid. It says, search your deck for a Pokemon, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So this is actually just a reprint of an older card called Trevor. Trevor was just like a starter deck promo, so it was definitely not a card that you saw too much of, and it really wasn't even a super good card when it came out. And I don't really expect too much differently with PokeKid as well, if I have to be honest. It is nice that we are getting an assortment of different searching options. That was one of the big things this format has been lacking. But I think compared to some of the other stuff that we've looked at and will look at in this set review, I think PokeKid's definitely the worst of the bunch, just because it is a supporter. Ideally, this would be an item card, or if it is a supporter, you would want to be able to grab multiple Pokemon, like in the case of a Pokemon fan club, or a Pokemaniac, or Professor Elm's lecture, whatever it might be. So I think this card isn't super good, if I just have to be honest. Seems like definitely one of the less playable cards we've looked at thus far in the set review.
While I think that Eric's correct on everything, I think it's a little bit better than what he's giving it off. So I remember back in like 2011 at a regional championships, there was a format where there was a lot of item lock and stuff like that, so you couldn't play your item cards. So I decided to run Bebe's Search and cut down on my item cards so I could always get my Pokemon out. And there was another format where I actually played Trevor at a league challenge in the same kind of era, like different format, but same kind of metagame where it's just like whenever there's item lock, it's good to have options. So not necessarily that I'm going to play this card, not necessarily that I think it's a great option, but as we can see in our current format as of recording, there's a lot of Omastars out in the format and a lot of different decks. I think it's one of those things where we might see decks, if PokeKid was an option, players might actually consider it. So just having the consideration option is nice. Even though it's not a great option, still having more options than not is cool. So I'm going to probably give this card like middle of the road, like lower middle of the road, almost unplayable.
Yeah, I'm not going to be quite that generous. I respect that, but yeah, I'm definitely in the camp of saying this card isn't very good. Definitely, I think we can both agree out of all of the great trainer cards we've been looking at, this is definitely one of the least impactful, though, if nothing else. So probably won't see the type of success that some of these other ones have seen. Next up, guys, we have another reprint coming back into the format, and that is going to be Pokemon Catcher. So Pokemon Catcher says, flip a coin. If heads, switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active. So Pokemon Catcher, it's kind of funny to see how far this card has fallen from grace. Originally, it was released, it was actually one of the most impactful cards of its time because it used to not be on a coin flip. But after they changed it to a coin flip, the card started to see virtually no play, especially since we had other cards like Lysander and Guzma in the format alongside of it. But now we're in a format without these reliable gusting options. Pokemon Catcher, I think, actually might have a chance to come back into the format and see some play here. Because you have to think we have Custom Catcher, we have Ninetales, and we have Great Catcher. Those are the main gusting options we have, and they're all highly conditional. Great Catcher obviously loses value now that we have Pokemon V entering the mix. Ninetales obviously is going to be only for fire decks that run a ton of energy. Custom Catcher is kind of hard to make use of in decks that aren't greens decks. So there's actually, I think, kind of a lane carved out for just a general gusting method. And I think Pokemon Catcher could kind of fill that role. It's hard for me to really commit to saying this is a card that's going to be good, since we do have other different gusting options, but it does kind of seem like there is a role for this to fill that's really not being taken up right now.
I think it's very similar to we saw Great Catcher and everyone's like, oh, Custom Catcher sucks. We're not playing Custom Catchers. And now you look at it, Custom Catchers might even be played more than Great Catcher, just because we want to be bringing up these other Pokemon. Now, this is half a custom, you play it at half the cost of Custom Catcher because you don't need to play two cards at the same time. It is at the cost of a coin flip, but isn't there that other supporter as well that allows a flip to be a heads will? So we can use will if our deck allows us to play will. I'm not, by no means, do not take this and say play will, because I'm not entirely sold on that card. I think it's one of those things where it's interesting. You have options. I think Pokemon Catcher it's always been an okay-ish card. And the fact is, we got to look at our surroundings. We got Ninetales, Great Catcher, Custom Catcher. Now we got Pokemon Catcher. It's an option in the mix for sure. There's decks that have run Fion for the same reason that they'd run a Pokemon Catcher. So the fact that you don't need to juggle combo pieces or worry about if a Pokemon's a GX, a V, a VMAX, a normal Pokemon. It's just an easy card to play, and I think that that's what's going to allow it to like sneak into lists. So I'm about it.
So I'm actually going to remain a little bit neutral on Pokemon Catcher here, just because we do have a lot of other gusting options. But what makes me optimistic for this card's future is that we did see Pokemon Reversal, which is the same exact thing as this effect. Did see play in its respective formats when it was legal. We saw it even maxed out in 4 counts. We even saw Volcanion EX decks when Lysander still existed. Some played a heavy Pokemon Catcher line in their decks for like one regional cycle. So there is precedent, I think, for this card to see some play. So I'm going to be cautiously optimistic for this card and remain kind of in the middle, as I said. Next up, guys, we have Professor's Research. This is another card I know a lot of people have been talking about coming back into the game, but it says discard your hand and draw 7. So one thing that is important to point out really quick, it says it's called Professor's Research, but on the other side of the card, it says Professor Magnolia. So what this kind of is implying, at the least, is we might be getting other Professor's Research cards coming out in the future with different effects. So that's kind of a side point we'll have to kind of keep a lookout for in the future. But the core effect here will look very familiar to anyone who's been playing the game for any period of time, just because we've had this effect on several cards, most recently on Professor Sycamore, before that Professor Juniper, and of course, famously before that, the old Professor Oak trainer card as well. So discard your hand, draw 7 has been one of the best effects on a supporter in the game for as long as this effect has really been around. And, we've been without Sycamore for a little while now. So it's kind of cool to see this come back into the game. And I definitely think there are situations to play this card, though I will admit I don't think this will be as widely played as Sycamore or Juniper were. So typically the decks that play these sort of effects the most in the past were all basic decks and sometimes like stage 1 decks. Those are really the decks that could get the most consistent value out of a card like this, just because they don't have too many moving pieces. But right now, a lot of the basic decks in the format are based around Welder, and they're based around greens. And so a lot of them really won't be playing a card like this. So I think initially what I'm looking at is the decks that are going to play this are going to be all basic or half basic, half stage 1 decks, maybe kind of like Malamar, that aren't on a greens or welder engine. Those are the decks that are going to want to play this, especially if they do get a benefit from discarding cards, like in the case of Malamar wanting to get Psychic Energies in the discard, or maybe in the case of something like Pikarom, even where they don't mind discarding their hand as well. Zach also pointed out to me too, we are getting Fishing Rod in the same set, so it makes playing a card like this a little less punishing than it would have been up until this point as well. So, I mean, it's cool to have this back, but do you think it'd be fair to say that this effect actually might not even be as popular as it was in previous formats?
We've seen the effect before. It's seen a lot of play. It still sees play, but are there decks that are going to play it? And I'm not sure. We have Cynthia, we have Marnie, we have Lily, we have lots of other options. And the other thing, too, with the new supporter rule change where you can't play a supporter going first, it's weird in general where it's just like, maybe I want to play something a little bit different. I just don't know exactly with the rule change if it's something that I'm going to immediately jump on. Obviously, I'm going to do some playtesting with it. Obviously, I'm going to experiment with this card.
So one thing I actually want to point out that you kind of mentioned is the first turn rule change. I think that's actually a reason this could see more play, because I think cards like Lily instantly lose a lot more value. Like, one of the big challenges with Lily is having it in your hand on your first turn, and now you have to have it in your hand on the first turn going second if you want the primary effect out of it. So I actually think cards like that get a little bit worse, and we might see people prefer something like Professor's Research over that, just because it is going to be more reliable.
And that's probably fair on Lily's behalf, but at the same time, I feel like Marnie might be better because you're just drawing 2 less and you're not pitching your hand. For me, I try to be a pretty resourceful player, so unless I'm immediately benefiting off of discarding cards, so let's say if I'm playing a Mewtwo Mew list, that I want to get a bunch of Pokemon in my discard pile. However, I probably wouldn't want to play this with Mewtwo Mew, because when you're playing a deck that plays Welder, you usually only want to play Welder. So, I don't know, maybe like Blacephalon GX would be cool with this. I think that might be a cool way to run this card. but I don't think there's any specific deck right now that's going to be like, oh my, this deck needs it right now, or this deck, oh, if only we had Sycamore. So I like having this as an option. I'm going to give it a good. It's super playable card. I just don't know if and when and where it's going to be super playable. It's going to be on a case by case basis. Same way as like Juniper, you instantly know it's playable, but you can't play it in every single deck.
So while I would agree that this card doesn't just immediately come and see play in every deck like we saw with Professor Juniper and Professor Sycamore, I still think this effect is still good even in 2020. There are decks that will look to abuse this. Not every basic deck is going to be playing greens or welder. So naturally, this is probably going to be their primary supporter of choice going forward. And even, like I said, with decks like Malamar and with the new first turn rule change, maybe making Lily a little bit worse if you're going first now, I think Professor's Research definitely has a lot of chance to shine. So I also think this card is very good. I think I'm a little bit more enthusiastic about it than Zach, but we're both in agreement. It's still a good effect. Next up, guys, we have Quick Ball. This is definitely another one of the cards in this set that people have been really excited to see. It's a new item card. It says you discard a card from hand and search your deck for a basic Pokemon, or reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So this is the card we've been, waiting for many months. After this past year's rotation, our searching options have been abysmal. Unless you were a GX deck or a tag team of some sort, or like a psychic type, your options to get set up have really been poor, and Quick Ball is just going to help so many different decks. I have to say, this might even be within my top 3 favorite cards of the set. It's such a simple effect. I actually did an entire video on this not too long ago, just in terms of all of the impacts that Quick Ball will have on the game. But now some of these other types like water or fire or fighting that haven't had great searching options outside of their GX counterparts now have ways to get set up. And of course, everyone knows there's tons of decks that benefit from the discard, like Malamar, Mewtwo, etc. So the discarding effect here isn't really even a downside most of the time either. So it's a straightforward card, but I mean, Zach, you can tell I'm pretty excited for this one.
I'd say that this would probably be one of the best cards in the game at the time of release. We've been stripped of almost all of our options when it comes to Nest Ball and Ultra Ball and things like that. And the fact that this card doesn't even put it on the bench, I'd almost argue that it's better than Nest Ball, where it's like Nest Ball couldn't grab a Dedenne, Nest Ball couldn't grab a Tapu Lele, whereas Quick Ball can grab a Dedenne GX and you can play it down in the same turn and do things with it. So a lot of these effects from hand cards, like Galarian, Zigzagoon, like just discarding a card is usually a huge plus in Pokemon in most decks. Where it's like if you're playing a Mewtwo Mew deck and you want to discard a Reshiram Charizard GX from your hand to be able to get the effect off, or a Naganadel GX so you can snipe your opponent's bench, and you can grab it at any in the same turn. I feel like a card like this just makes our game a lot more consistent, which is going to make it a lot more skill based. There's going to be less dead drawing. Overall, I think this card is just absolutely amazing, and I think it's going to be a staple unless they somehow print a better card. And considering it's taken us this while since Nest Ball to receive a card like this, or this long since Ultra Ball to receive a card like this, I'm gonna hold out and say that I don't think there's gonna be many better cards coming than this in the future that can get printed. So I'm pretty excited for the lifespan of this card. And I'm gonna try to pick up as many as I can because I don't want to proxy this card up when I build like 20 decks.
Yeah, and to your credit about not seeing stuff that's going to be better than this, with the new first turn rules, looking to put decks reliant on stuff like Elm at a disadvantage, Quick Ball now kind of looks to maybe replace your engine to get your basics into play. So if you were a deck that previously ran Professor Elm's Lecture, I guess you still can, but on the turns that you go first, those Elms are just going to be sitting dead in your hand, whereas Quick Ball, you can at least bench something else down to make sure you don't get benched out on your opponent's first turn. So that's another thing that Quick Ball is really going to help with, I think, in this new format. So we're both in agreement. This is definitely a great card. One of the best in the set. Like Zach said, probably one of the best in the game once it releases at the time. So yeah, huge thumbs up for Quick Ball. Very, very good. Next up, guys, we have a new item card that is going to be a Rotom Bike. It says draw cards until you have 6 cards in hand, but then your turn ends. So this is actually kind of similar to the Tropical Beach Stadium we've seen in expanded format, see a lot of play. And this is an item card, so I think maybe the knee-jerk reaction for some people would be, hey, that's pretty good because you can, do this a bunch in the game. Also, with the new first turn rules, you don't have a great way at drawing cards, so play Rotom Bike, right? But I would actually say this card doesn't really do a good job at that. And the reason for that is because even though you can see cards on the first turn without a supporter, you can't bench anything. And that's really the big issue with this, is that if you were still allowed to bench Pokemon you draw into, it wouldn't be that bad. Because now if you start with a lone basic, you play Rotom Bike, your turn ends, guess what? You can still get benched out on your opponent's first turn, which is pretty bad. So I don't think this fills that sort of role at all. I think really where this card could potentially shine one day is in a deck that actually doesn't attack or do damage. So a good example would maybe be the old Chandelure deck from back in the day, though this probably isn't a perfect example because it played the item block Vileplume. But basically, your deck never really attacked to do damage. All of your damage was done via an ability, and you would usually end your turn with Tropical Beach. So if a deck like that ever comes out where you are just doing damage via an ability, maybe you could play Rotom Bike in a deck like that. Though some of the baby Pokemon might fill a similar role in that regard, since they also end your turn and maybe they're a little bit better. Who knows? But my point is, that's the type of role I would see for this. I actually think you would not see this in any aggressive, like attacking deck. You would probably see this more in some sort of control deck, or maybe in some deck that doesn't do damage via an attack.
You want to know what I think I'm pretty much right there with you, Eric, where it's just like I'm not entirely sure how I feel about this card overall. It's one of those things where drawing up to six seems pretty cool. Or drawing until you have six, not up to six. That'd be a little bit better. But I don't want to be using this if I'm trying to attack. So it's only decks that don't attack, so ability-based damage or control aspects, things like that. Right now, we currently have better options, I think, in terms of Munchlax to end my turn, to grab a card back from my discard pile, any card back. And Rotom Bike is, you also have to find a way to get the Rotom Bike out. It's not like it's Tropical Beach where it's a stadium that stays in play. So right now, I think this card's generally kind of bad right now. It might have some room for the future, but in general, I'm going to say it's kind of bad.
Next up, we have another Pokemon tool card. This one's going to be Citrus Berry. It says, at the end of each player's turn, if the Pokemon this card is attached to has at least 3 damage counters on it, heal 30 damage from that Pokemon, then discard this card. So my first thought when looking at this is, yeah, that's fine, but if you are trying to heal 30 damage, why not just play Giant Charm? And the reason I say that is because Giant Charm increases your maximum amount of HP, which means it's harder for you to get one-shotted, whereas Citrus Berry actually doesn't change how easy it is for you to get one-shotted. Either way, it's only healing 30, which is basically the same as getting plus 30. If this was a 30 reduction, much like with the old Eviolite or Hard Charm, something kind of akin to that, then I think there's actually an argument to playing this over something like Giant Charm. But since it's just a heal 30, it doesn't really seem any better than Giant Charm.
I really just don't see a reason to play this card beyond it just being a Pokemon tool card for a generalized effect to do extra damage or to get a free attack off or something like that. If there's a way where it's like if you played a Citrus Berry on your last turn, some kind of future-proofed card, that might be a cool way to run it. But right now, we got to look at what we have available to us. And I don't know if this is going to make Alolan Ninetales any better of a deck. I don't know if this is going to make Rotom any better of a deck. I just don't think we have very many great options or many great ways to play this card. And therefore, it's going to get a pretty rough rating for me. So I'm going to give it bad right now.
Yeah, I will throw out one thing before we kind of wrap up on this card in terms of the recoil damage you mentioned. Some of the only situations where that actually can be good to play Citrus Berry instead is something like if you're going against Chomptina, which is reliant on your opponent having damage counters. This would be better in that situation if you are able to like cleanly heal the 30. Like if you're taking 30 and healing that exact amount, something like that would actually be better against something like Chomptina. But generally speaking, Giant Charm is like effectively just the same in most instances. But I did want to throw that out there at the least. But overall, Zach, I mean, I'm right there with you. I definitely don't think this is very good. I think Giant Charm is kind of an okay card already. And the fact that this is kind of like a worse version of that in most instances means this probably really won't ever do anything. So yeah, not a big fan of Citrus Berry here. Next up, guys, we have a new supporter card that is going to be Team Yell Grunt. So put an energy from your opponent's Pokemon into their hand. So much like with some of the other Grunt cards of the past, this is all about energy manipulation. Of course, we had Team Skull Grunt, which discarded energy from your opponent's hand. We have Team Flare Grunt, which discarded energy from their active. This is probably one of the weaker versions of this effect, but nevertheless, it definitely fills a role that we don't have in the current format. So most decks aren't going to play something like this. It's primarily going to be control decks, like your Florges decks maybe, or your Oranguru, like control style decks, just because they want to play things like Crushing Hammers, and of course something like Team Yell Grunt to deny your opponent of energy to make sure they can't take prizes. I don't expect to see it have much success out of there. But Zach, do you think the fact that this isn't a discard is going to make a difference in terms of decks choosing to play it?
This one, it's nice because it's not specifically special or basic energy. But a lot of the times with special energies were to hit the discard pile, they're as good as getting a Lost Zone or something like that. I think Team Yell Grunts, we're going to see some play with it, or players at least experimenting with it. It's, however, one of those things where if your opponent can continuously attach an energy, it's not really great. Maybe you could go Lieutenant Surge and wipe off 2 energies, so they're always stuck attaching 1. Or maybe you could go Lieutenant Surge and Mars that energy away. So I think control decks can make use of this card because we don't have a supporter card that you can keep on using. But right now they could always just go Crushing Hammer, Oranguru, get them back. So it's interesting in general. I just don't know if it has a spot right now, especially with Crushing Hammer still being in format. And I believe Crushing Hammer is also reprinted in the set, so that's not really being changed too much. Maybe it's if Oranguru is out of our format, this card might see a little bit more play. But the fact that you could like loop Crushing Hammers back through your deck and weave them through to draw them back seems a little bit better. I'm gonna give this card a kind of meh. It's playable, but not really that playable. Not really sure. We'll see exactly how the future holds up for it. Kind of rating on this card.
I'm pretty neutral on this card. The effect fills a role that we don't have, but the effect isn't as oppressive as some of the other forms that we've seen with these types of cards in the past. But nevertheless, there are decks that do want this type of effect. So I think for that reason alone, we have to be somewhat optimistic for it, and we can't completely write it off just yet. Alrighty guys, next up we have the very last card in the set review. It's going to be a new special energy that we're getting in Sword and Shield. That's going to be Aurora Energy. So it says, whenever you attach this card from your hand to a Pokemon, discard a card from your hand. While on play, this card provides every type of energy, but only provides 1 energy at a time. So this is basically Rainbow Energy, but just with a different downside. So Rainbow Energy does the same thing, but of course you have to take 1 damage counter whenever you attach it. This is kind of the same thing, but instead of the damage counter, you discard a card from your hand. And that's really not even a bad thing. So think of something like Mewtwo Mew GX. I think a lot of times they would actually prefer Aurora Energy because not only do they get to discard stuff to put into the discard pile to copy the attacks of, but also they get to get around something like Mimikyu that the 1 damage counter would actually make them struggle with. So I think this is an easy inclusion if you're a Mewtwo Mew deck that's playing Rainbow Energies. It's an easy switch over to something like this, I think. And really just any deck that already plays Rainbow Energy where the 1 damage counter makes a difference. Like, if the 1 damage counter makes no difference in terms of the math of pop your attackers one-shotting you, then you can probably still play Rainbow Energy. But if that 1 damage counter does matter, it's an easy switch over to Aurora Energy. This is, I think, one of the best special energies we've had in quite some time, I think personally, Zach.
I totally agree with that. I'm thinking about situations at the San Diego Regional Championships. I played against Diego Casaraga, the world champion from 2017. He was playing an Arceus-style Palkia deck, attached a Rainbow Energy to his Pokemon, and my Victini was 1 energy less necessary to knock it out in my discard pile, which allowed me to take a huge knockout on one of his Pokemon. So it's one of those things where if you look at it, 10, as we look at Fine Band, even though Fine Band isn't crazy, 10 damage around here and there adds up. So Shrine of Punishment, Rainbow, Fine Band, cards like that, it does add up over time. The fact that this one is only the mere drawback of discarding a card, which a lot of decks like Mewtwo Mew GX love discarding cards just to get an extra option in their discard pile. That can almost be seen as a plus for a bunch of different energies, or for a bunch of different cards. So I think this is just strictly an amazing special energy. Any deck that plays multi types, or even even if you don't by nature, like I might consider running a copy of this in a deck that plays a Dedenne GX just because it gives me an option to attack with the Dedenne GX. Find some real justification to be running an energy like this if you're running only one type of energy right now. But if your deck was running rainbow energy in the past, this seems like a great spiritual upgrade, unless you can deal with the 10 damage, and that's less of a drawback than discarding a card. But I think that this card is just strictly great. I just really like it. I'm kind of lost for words on this one. I really like this card.
There's no shortage of decks that like stuff in the discard too. There's Malamar, though I think you probably, more than likely, won't be playing this in Malamar. But nevertheless, you have the option. You even have stuff with the new Zacian V. You want to discard cards, and this opens you up to playing maybe something like ADP and Guzma and Hala with like the tag call engine if you want to go that route. So I definitely fully expect this card to see play. If this is in fact the last card in our Sword and Shield set review, I think we picked a really good note to end this thing on. Roar Energy, I think one of my favorite special energies we've had in some time, and I think definitely a card that you should expect to see some play. So there it is, guys. We finally made it to the end of our Sword and Shield set review. Thanks so much for all you guys sticking with us the entire way. I know these set reviews tend to be a little bit long, but we had a lot of cards to go over, and we appreciate you guys sticking with us throughout this whole thing. So before we wrap up this video, guys, we're just going to have a quick little recap just to give our kind of final thoughts as a whole on the new Sword and Shield set. So there's definitely some good things about this. Of course, we have the new Pokemon V and Pokemon VMAX. Always exciting when a new block of cards kicks off a new game mechanic in some way. So there's definitely some pretty playable ones that we're getting. Zacian V, I think it's going to be one of the big ones. But also some of the VMAX Pokemon, like Lapras and Snorlax in particular, I think also are going to have a chance to shine as well. We also got some new metal support. We have the new Metal Saucer card, we got the Galarian Berserker, and of course we got the new Zacian V, and also to a lesser extent Zamazenta V as well, to give Metal some strong new attackers that they can consider. But even outside of Metal Saucer, one of the best things about Sword and Shield is the insane lineup of trainer cards that we have. I think out of all of the cards that we looked at, the only ones that really stuck out as being kind of bad or lackluster would maybe be the berry cards and maybe Pokekid. But outside of that, guys, there is a ton of stuff. You have the incredible new searching options with Quick Ball and Evolution Incense. We got one of the best draw supporters coming back into the game in the form of Professor Magnolia. We finally got a reliable form of recovery in the format with Fishing Rod. So there's just a lot of things that are really going to be impactful in terms of trainers. That's definitely, I think, Sword and Shield's legacy is just going to be all of the insane trainer cards that we got in this set. So on the flip side, I think the Pokemon in this set are a little bit weaker compared to our trainer cards, though we do have a couple of cool new archetypes that I think we'll see play. I think compared to some of the other more recent sets, I think the total selection of potentially viable new archetypes is a little bit on the lower end, but nevertheless, there's still a lot to like here. So as a result, we're going to give the new Sword and Shield set a 4 out of 5. There's some debate between all of us at Rare Candy if we want to go closer to a 3 or a 4, but that's ultimately where we landed. I think the trainer card selection here is just so strong, and it's really going to carry this set in terms of its legacy in the game. But as usual with our set reviews, guys, what do you think about the new cards that we're getting? What are some of the ones that you liked, didn't like? Are there any cards that you thought we were a little too easy on, or do you think that we were a little too harsh on some others? Definitely sound off below down in the comment section and let us know what you're thinking about this new Sword and Shield set. But if you did enjoy this content, of course, feel free to like and subscribe, and consider supporting this channel by becoming a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg, or by picking up some merch from our online store, rarecandytcg.com. It would mean a lot. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.